Preface. For as long as human beings have had the ability to communicate, we have endeavored to persuade one another, whether it be for the purposes of mere survival, or to control the circumstances of our lives, or to bring someone around to our way of thinking, or merely to win an argument. We have relied on some form of persuasion, either physical force or, what we would consider more civilized means, speaking and writing, to accomplish our goals and purposes. The art of verbal persuasion, in a word, rhetoric, was discovered in the West in the democracies of Syracuse and Athens during the 5th century BC. Citizens in democratic societies were expected to express themselves in assembly, represent themselves in courts of law, and participate in other civic functions. As a result, in order to enable people to operate successfully in society, attempts were made to describe effective means of verbal persuasion, and a theoretical system evolved that enabled citizens to plan and execute a successful speech in public, in other words, to win an argument. Several centuries later, Rome's greatest orator, and one of the greatest speakers of all time, Marcus Tullius Cicero, secured Rome's highest political office, the consulship, having relied heavily on this art of verbal persuasion to make a name for himself in Roman society. Trained from boyhood in the technicalities of rhetoric, Cicero excelled not only as an effective public speaker, who won the vast majority of arguments in which he was involved, but also as a theorist in the art of verbal persuasion, having written during his lifetime several treatises that have rhetoric as their subject. And although he is highly critical of the typical rhetorical handbooks of the day, he was, nonetheless, steeped in their doctrine and reliant upon their methods. In fact, this rhetorical education for civic duty, handed down by the Greeks and adopted by the Romans, remained a primary element in the training of all educated people throughout the Middle Ages, into the Renaissance, and even down into modern times. Given the centrality of rhetoric, that is, the art of verbal persuasion, in our Western tradition, I present here a short anthology of passages from Cicero's writings, primarily his rhetorical treatises, that capture the essence of this ancient rhetorical system of persuasion, a system that helped to make Cicero and countless other orators effective speakers, able to convince people and win arguments. Readers will, I hope, find these selections interesting in their own right, as well as useful when thinking about their own efforts to persuade. Indeed, whether arguing with a friend over a trivial issue or presenting a brief before the Supreme Court, the goal of a speaker is still to persuade, and knowing the most effective means of persuasion in any given circumstance will lead to the successful realization of that goal. A peculiar paradox of contemporary American society is that, at a time when we find many schools, colleges, and universities talking seriously about fostering oral competency and good communication skills in their students, we actually see very few effective public speakers in action, in the courts, in our communities, or in the public arena of political life. While this book is certainly not intended to remedy that situation, my hope is that those who think about speaking in public and want to win arguments will find it appealing, and will delight in the realization that the techniques for effective oral persuasion discovered and enunciated millennia ago still make sense and have great relevance for those who would speak convincingly today. In order to simplify matters and allow for smoother reading, I have avoided appending footnotes to names and terms that might present challenges to readers who are unfamiliar with the historical period or the technical subject matter. In lieu of such notes, a glossary of names and terms has been included near the end of the volume to which the reader can refer when seeking more detailed information or clarification. In addition, a list of suggestions for further reading on the subject has also been appended, consisting of both primary works by Cicero in English translation as well as secondary works that elucidate and comment upon ancient rhetoric and oratory, Cicero, and his works. All translations, except those from De Orator, are my own. De Orator passages were previously translated jointly by my colleague, Jacob Wyss, and me, and appeared originally in our complete translation of the treatise, published by Oxford University Press in 2001, Cicero, on the Ideal Orator. Occasionally, I have altered a word or two of that original translation in the passages that appear here. I would like to thank Mr. Robert Tempio, Executive Editor and Humanities Group Publisher for Princeton University Press, for suggesting this volume to me, and for his guidance and direction in seeing it through to publication, and Sarah Lerner, Senior Production Editor. I owe a debt of gratitude also to my copy editor, Jennifer Harris, and to the anonymous referees of the press, whose corrections, observations, and suggestions improved the manuscript greatly. I dedicate this little book to Augustus James May, in the hopes that, as he grows in age and wisdom, he will realize the ideal of the elder Cato, becoming a vir bonus dicendi peritus. A good man, skilled in speaking. James M. May, St. Olaf College. Cicero's Life, a brief sketch. Marcus Tullius Cicero was born on January 3, 106 BC, in Arpinum, a town approximately 70 miles southeast of Rome, to a family that, though not members of the Roman nobility, was prominent in the local community and had important connections in the capital. While Marcus and his brother, Quintus, were still boys, the family moved to Rome, a move aimed at advancing the education and prospects of the brothers. There the boys were brought into contact with the two leading orators of the day, Lucius Licinius Crassus and Marcus Antonius, who were later to become the two chief speakers in Cicero's greatest rhetorical treatise, a dialogue on the ideal orator, de orator. In such an environment, from boyhood on, Cicero was able to observe Rome's leading speakers and statesmen operating on a daily basis in the courts and in the forum. After Crassus's death in 91 BC, Cicero, at the age of 15 or 16, assumed the toga of manhood and was formally introduced to Quintus Mucius Scaevola, the augur, one of Rome's greatest legal experts, who was also given a place as one of the speakers in De Orator. Under his tutelage, Cicero acquired his enormous respect and knowledge of the civil law. The young Cicero was, no doubt, a precocious student. In addition to his oratorical and legal studies with Crassus, Antonius, and Scaevola, he developed an interest in and abiding love for philosophy. While still a teenager, he published his first rhetorical work, De Invention, or On Invention, which in later years he would describe as the sketchy and unsophisticated work that found its way out of my notebooks when I was a boy, or rather a youth. De Orator 1.5, though even that work continued to exert a tremendous influence on rhetorical and oratorical studies throughout the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. After a brief tour of military service during the war with the Italian allies, Cicero returned to a Rome that, during the decade of the 80s BC, was largely torn apart by civil strife, bloodshed, and proscription, brought on by the conflict between the strong arms, Marius, Cinna, and Sulla. When some sense of order had finally been restored and the courts began to function again regularly, Cicero took up his first civil cases, to be followed in 80 BC by his first criminal case, his defense of Roscius of Ameria on a charge of parricide. Shortly after this impressive victory, he decided to continue his education by spending about 2 years on what amounted to a grand tour of Greece, where he met, interacted, and studied with several prestigious rhetoricians, orators, and philosophers. He returned to Rome in 77 BC, a more vigorous and refined speaker. Cicero was now nearly 30 years old, the minimum age requirement for standing for the office of quaestor, a sort of public treasurer or paymaster. As mentioned earlier, his family was not numbered among the Roman nobility. None of them before him had become a Roman senator by virtue of being elected to public office. Thus, as a so-called new man novus homo, Cicero found himself in a notably disadvantaged political position, seeing that election to the higher magistracies at Rome was jealously guarded by, and generally restricted to, members of this nobility of rank. Nonetheless, he managed to win the election, finishing first on the ballot and in his first eligible year, and served as quaestor in Sicily. The connections he forged there accrued to his benefit 5 years later, when the Sicilians, recalling his good and upright service, enlisted him to prosecute Gaius Verres, the corrupt governor of the island from 73 to 70 BC, on a charge of extortion. His stunning success in the case, against the power of the senatorial order and Hortensius, the most famous advocate of the day who was defending Verres, catapulted Cicero into the limelight as Rome's leading orator and advocate. Other political offices followed for Cicero: aedile, praetor, and finally consul, the highest magistracy in Republican Rome. During the final months of Cicero's year as consul in 63 BC, he uncovered a plot to overthrow the government, led by a revolutionary, bankrupt senator of noble descent, Lucius Sergius Catiline. Through his diligence, the assistance of informants, and his inspiring oratory, students of Latin will be familiar with the justly famous Catilinarian orations. Cicero managed to thwart the coup and, with the threat still imminent, to gain approval of the Senate, over the objections of some, for execution of the conspirators without a trial. In the aftermath, a public thanksgiving was decreed and Cicero was hailed as Pater Patri, father of the fatherland. In this moment of triumph, when he had seemingly managed to unite the Roman people against the threat of the coup, Cicero envisioned a harmony among the various social classes of Rome, Concordia Ordinum. Only a few years later, however, forces would conspire to dash that dream and to transform the source of Cicero's crowning glory into one of debilitating disgrace. In 60 BC, various maneuverings and political machinations had fostered an alliance between three powerful men, Julius Caesar, the great general Pompey, and the wealthy Marcus Crassus, a distant relative of Cicero's boyhood mentor. Although initially invited to join the coalition, Cicero ultimately could not bring himself to support this so-called First Triumvirate, and they, in turn, were content to give free rein to his opponents, chief of whom was his archenemy, the tribune Publius Clodius, who managed to force him into exile in 58 BC for executing Roman citizens without a trial. Taking refuge in Greece, Cicero endured the most miserable year and a half of his life, during which he suffered acute depression and even contemplated suicide. The Senate recalled him in triumph in 57 BC, but the triumvirs still held sway in Rome, and had warned Cicero, through the agency of his brother, Quintus, not to pursue any policy hostile to their interests. In fact, at the behest of the triumvirs he was even forced against his will to defend several of his former enemies. In this sort of repressive environment, Cicero turned to writing and spent the last several years of the decade composing some of his most important and significant literary treatises, including De Orator, on the ideal orator, De Republica, on the Republic, and De Legibus, on the laws. In 51 BC, Cicero was assigned by the Senate to serve as proconsul of the province of Cilicia in Asia Minor, modern southwestern Turkey, where he executed his duties, honorably, restoring order, and even undertaking a brief but very successful military campaign against some warring hill tribes. The political situation back in Rome had been deteriorating for several years. The triumvir Crassus had been killed on military campaign in Parthia in 53, and the relationship between the remaining triumvirs, Caesar and Pompey, was fast approaching a breaking point. Only a few weeks following Cicero's return to Rome from his governorship in Cilicia, full-scale civil war broke out, January 49 BC. After much hesitation, personal deliberation, and a failed attempt to reconcile Caesar and Pompey, Cicero eventually joined the Republican forces under the command of Pompey in Greece. But following their defeat at Pharsalus in 48, he returned to Italy and, after another stretch of agonizing uncertainty, was among those pardoned by Caesar and permitted to remain in the country. Others in the Republican cause, including Cato the Younger, fought on. During the ensuing dictatorship of Caesar, Cicero again saw his opportunities for playing a significant role in the public arena greatly curtailed. Moreover, the tragic death of his beloved daughter, Tullia, in 45 BC forced him further into withdrawal and near despair. As he had done a decade earlier in forced retirement, he turned to writing as he searched for consolation, and during this period composed a remarkable number of rhetorical and philosophical works, including Brutus, Orator, De Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, on moral ends, Tusculan Disputations, and De Natura Deorum, on the nature of the gods. While not directly involved in the assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides, 15th of March, 44 BC, Cicero viewed it as an opportunity for the Republic to rise again from its ashes. But the subsequent actions of Mark Antony, one of Caesar's close friends and his colleague in the consulship that year, soon led Cicero to fear that Rome had merely substituted one tyrant for another. Taking up what would be his final and perhaps most courageous cause, he managed to rally the people and the Senate of Rome through a series of speeches that he called Philippics, likening them by their title to the speeches that the great Greek orator Demosthenes had delivered 300 years earlier against Philip II of Macedon. But in the end, Cicero's hopes of a restored republic were dashed, when the young and ambitious grandnephew and heir of Caesar, Octavian, later to be Caesar Augustus, joined forces with Antony and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus in a second triumvirate that immediately set about eliminating their opposition to control of the state. Cicero's name appeared prominently on the list of the proscribed, and after being hunted down near Formi, his head and hands were severed from his body by Antony's minions and brought back to Rome, where they were prominently displayed on the rostra, the speaker's platform, where Cicero had so often stood to address the Roman people. Cicero's enduring legacy stems largely from his writings. In fact, we know more about Cicero than perhaps any other person of antiquity, largely owing to the vast corpus of his works that survive today. Nearly 60 of his speeches are extant, as well as a score of philosophical and rhetorical works, and almost 1,000 personal letters. These writings have been valued from his day down to our own times, and provide for us the portrait of the man in all of his dimensions: orator, rhetorician, politician, philosopher, and patriot. How to win an argument. The origins of eloquent and persuasive speech. Nature, art, practice. The precise nature of eloquent and persuasive speech was fiercely debated in antiquity. Is rhetoric an actual art, or merely a skill, a knack? Does it require natural ability, or can it be mastered merely through the acquisition of certain techniques and the memorization of a body of rules and precepts? Generally, the ancient theorists spoke of a requisite triad: natural ability or inborn talent, mastery of the art of speaking as outlined in rhetorical treatises, called arts in Latin, and diligent application of one's talent and training through practice. In his earliest published work, De Invention, or On Invention, written when he was about 17 years old, Cicero offers an explanation of the origin of eloquence. And if we wish to consider the origin of this thing that is called eloquence, whether it be an art or a study or some sort of skill or a faculty bestowed by nature, we will discover that it was born from most honorable causes and continued its development for the best of reasons. For there was a time when people wandered in the fields far and wide, like beasts, and preserved their existence relying on uncultivated food. No rational system of religion or of societal obligation was yet practiced. No one had witnessed legitimate marriage, nor had anyone looked upon children whom he knew for certain to be his own, nor had they realized what advantages an equitable code of law might provide. So, because of their own error and ignorance, a blind and reckless passion controlled them, and in order to satisfy itself, continually misused bodily strength, the most dangerous of servants. At this point in time, a man, great and wise to be sure, came to recognize the innate potential and the boundless opportunity for great accomplishments residing in the human spirit, if only someone could draw it out and improve it through instruction. He systematically assembled the people in one place. Scattered in the fields and living hidden in their woodland shelters, he brought them together, introducing them to every useful and honorable pursuit. At first, because of the novelty of the thing, they strongly objected. But then, as they began to listen more earnestly, he transformed them through reason and speech from wild, savage creatures into tame and gentle people. To me, at least, it does not seem possible that mute wisdom, devoid of speaking ability, was suddenly able to turn people from their accustomed ways and lead them to different modes of living. What is more, once cities had been established, how could it have happened that people learned to honor faith and uphold justice, and became accustomed to obeying others willingly, and judged that they must not only take on great tasks for the sake of the common good but even sacrifice their lives, unless others had been able to persuade them by eloquence of those things that they had discovered by reason? Certainly, no one who was endowed with great physical strength would have willingly and without violence submitted himself to the law, allowing himself to be put on an equal footing with those over whom he could excel, abandoning voluntarily a most agreeable custom, especially a custom that had through the course of time already acquired the force of a law of nature, had he not been moved by speech both powerful and persuasive. Eloquence, then, seems initially to have originated in this way, and to have advanced to greater development, and likewise subsequently, in the most important matters of peace and war, to have been involved with the highest interests of humankind. De Invention 1.2-3. Some 30 years later, Cicero wrote De Orator, on the ideal orator, a masterful treatise in which he constructs a portrait of his ideal speaker. The work is composed as a dialogue between several of the leading orators of the generation previous to Cicero's. The two main characters of the dialogue are Lucius Crassus and Marcus Antonius, Cicero's boyhood mentors and the greatest orators of Rome at that time. In the following passage, the interlocutor Crassus refers to these same origins of eloquence. He extols the capacity for speech as one of the most powerful and efficacious of all human gifts, and encourages his young protégés to master the art of eloquence. Actually, I think nothing is more admirable than being able, through speech, to take hold of human minds, to win over their inclinations, to drive them at will in one direction, and to draw them at will from another. It is this ability, more than anything else, that has ever flourished, ever reigned supreme in every free nation and especially in quiet and peaceful communities. What could be so wonderful as when out of an infinite crowd one human being emerges who, alone or with very few others, is able to use with effect the faculty that is a natural gift to all, or what is so pleasing to the mind and to the ear as speech distinguished and refined by wise thoughts and impressive words, or what so powerful and so splendid as one man's speech transforming the impulses of the people, the scruples of jurors, or the authority of the Senate? Again, what is so regal, so generous, so magnanimous, as lending aid to those in distress, raising up the afflicted, offering people safety, freeing them from dangers, saving them from exile? At the same time, what is so vital as always having the weapons available with which you can shield yourself and challenge the wicked or take revenge when attacked? But really, let us not always be preoccupied with the forum, with the court benches, the rostra, and the Senate House. If we consider our leisure time, what can be more pleasant or more properly human than to be able to engage in elegant conversation and show oneself a stranger to no subject? For the one thing that most especially sets us above animals is that we converse with one another, and that we can express our thoughts through speech. Who, then, would not rightly admire this ability, and would not think that he should take the greatest pains in order to surpass other human beings in the very thing that especially makes humans themselves superior to beasts? But let us now turn to what is surely the most important point of all. What other force could have gathered the scattered members of the human race into one place, or could have led them away from a savage existence in the wilderness to this truly human, communal way of life, or, once communities had been founded, could have established laws, judicial procedures, and civic rights? And to avoid enumerating still more points, they are actually almost numberless. Let me summarize everything in a few words. I assert that the leadership and wisdom of the perfect orator provide the chief basis, not only for his own dignity, but also for the safety of countless individuals and of the state at large. Therefore, young men, continue your present efforts and devote all your energies to the pursuit you are following, so that you can bring honor to yourselves, service to your friends, and benefit to the state. De Orator 1.30-34. Cicero, while obviously keenly aware and knowledgeable of the rules contained in the typical rhetorical treatises of his day, was highly critical of mere handbook learning. In fact, in De Orator, on the ideal orator, he routinely criticizes the hackneyed precepts of the handbooks. They perhaps serve a foundational purpose, but the ideal orator must, in addition to knowledge of rhetorical rules, possess a vast knowledge of all the humane arts, including history, literature, law, and philosophy. See later, 126-134. Such knowledge, along with natural ability, study, and diligent practice are essential for winning an argument. There exists a kind of observation of what is effective in speaking. But if this could make people eloquent, then everybody would be eloquent. For who would not be able to master this easily, or at least in some way or other? But in my view, such rules are powerful and useful, not because art can lead us to discover what to say, but because, when we have learned a proper point of reference, rules may assure us of the soundness, or make us see the weakness, of whatever we accomplish by means of our own natural ability, our study, and our training. De Orator 2.232. Rhetoric and Truth. The power wielded by a skillful speaker, who knows how to persuade through artful speech and appeal to human emotions, is, as outlined earlier, a powerful weapon. It is, in fact, a two-edged sword, one that can be employed for good or for ill. We need only to consider two extraordinarily effective 20th-century orators who were embroiled in the same conflict, Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler, to illustrate this point graphically. In such a context, it is easy to see why the word rhetoric often carries with it today a negative connotation. In ancient Greece, after the creation of a rhetorical system that was based largely on the principle of argumentation founded on probability, teachers of rhetoric emerged who rejected the ideal sphere of pure reason and absolute truth in favor of the probable and relative, who extolled the power of the word, and who sometimes endeavored to make the worse seem the better cause. Philosophers like Socrates and Plato, on the contrary, searching for final and absolute ends, championed truth uncovered through dialectical inquiry. Thus, the so-called quarrel between rhetoric and philosophy emerged, a quarrel that would endure, in varying manifestations and in varying levels of intensity, down to Cicero's time. The opening paragraph of Cicero's De Invention, on invention, reveals his thoughts on the matter. Often and much have I pondered the question of whether fluency of speech and a consuming devotion to eloquence have brought more good or evil to people and their communities. For when I consider the injuries done to our republic, and review in my mind the ancient calamities of prominent communities, I see that no little part of their misfortunes was brought about through the agency of men who were highly skilled in speaking. On the other hand, when I set out on a search in the annals of literature for events that, because of their antiquity, are removed from our generation's memory, I find that many cities have been founded, the flames of very many wars have been extinguished, the firmest alliances and the most hallowed friendships have been formed not only by the mind's power of reason but also more easily by eloquence. And after reflecting on it for a long time, that same power of reason leads me to form this opinion. First and foremost, wisdom without eloquence does too little for the good of communities, but eloquence without wisdom is, in most instances, extremely harmful and never beneficial. If, then, anyone exerts all of his energies in the practice of oratory to the neglect of the highest and most honorable pursuits of reason and moral conduct, he is reared as a citizen useless to himself and harmful to his country. But the person who arms himself with eloquence in such a way that enables him not to assail the interests of his country, but rather assist them, this man, in my opinion, will be a citizen most helpful and most devoted both to his own interests and those of the public. Cicero, De Invention 1:1. Several decades later, in his De Orator, Cicero will speak in more detail concerning the quarrel and will strive to effect a reconciliation or synthesis, combining philosophy, not so much with rhetoric, but with eloquence. Cicero's ideal orator is an oratorical philosopher, or a philosophical orator. Nonetheless, it is clear to anyone familiar with Cicero's oratorical career that on several occasions he defended clients whom he knew to be guilty. In fact, a later teacher of rhetoric, Quintilian, reports to us that Cicero once boasted that, in his defense of a client named Clentius, he threw dust in the eyes of the jury. Addressing his son near the end of his life, Cicero has something to say about defending guilty clients. It appears that our notion of granting every defendant a fair trial has at least some of its foundation in Cicero's way of thinking. And this precept of moral duty must be assiduously maintained, never lodge in court a capital charge against an innocent person. Indeed, there is no way this can be done without making oneself a criminal. For what is more inhuman than to turn one's eloquence, a gift bestowed by nature for the safety and preservation of our fellow humans, to the destruction and ruin of good people? Nevertheless, while this practice must be avoided, we need not be overly scrupulous about defending a guilty person, provided he is not abominably wicked. People want this. Custom sanctions it. Humanity accepts it. In court cases, it is always the duty of the juror to pursue the truth. It is sometimes the duty of the advocate to defend what is similar to the truth, even if it be less than the truth. De Officiis 2.51. The parts of rhetoric, or activities of the orator. Those who in antiquity taught and wrote about the art of persuasion regularly identified three genres of oratory, or types of cases: judicial, suited to seeking justice in courts of law; deliberative, whose goal is to argue what is most beneficial or expedient in a public meeting or before an assembly; and epidictic, or demonstrative, the oratory of praise or blame, perhaps best illustrated by the funeral oration or eulogy. Handbooks tended to concentrate on the judicial genre, as perhaps being most crucial and as lending itself best to systematic exposition. Ancient theorists organized their presentation around 5 parts, or activities of the orator: invention, discovering, that is, thinking out the material; arrangement, ordering the material; style, putting the ordered material into appropriate words; memory, memorizing the speech; and delivery, including directives about voice, facial expression, and gesture. These parts or activities parallel the process through which a speaker proceeds when composing and delivering a speech. Instruction in English composition, even in modern times, continued to endorse this process, at least through the first 3 stages. Those composing a speech or a detailed argument today will still find these activities effective means for organizing and presenting their points. Invention, identifying and classifying the question at issue according to the stance of argument, and discovering the sources of proof. Invention, Latin inventio, is concerned with finding and thinking out the subject matter of the speech. The process chiefly involves identifying and classifying the question at issue according to a specific stance of argument, as well as discovering the most promising sources of proof for persuading one's audience. Stances of argument. In a judicial controversy, the charge of the prosecution and the counterclaim by the defense crystallize the question at issue, that is, the matter under judgment, which in turn is classified according to one of four stances of argument, Latin status or constitutio, that is, according to the stand that is assumed by the defense. Cicero succinctly outlines this system in De Invention 1.10. Every subject that contains in itself some controversy situated in speech and debate involves a question about a fact, or about a definition, or about the nature or quality of an act, or about legal processes. Therefore, we call the question from which the whole case arises the status, or issue. The issue is the first conflict of pleas that arises from the defense of the accusation, in this manner: "You did it, I did not do it," or "I was justified in doing it." When the dispute is about a fact, the issue is called conjectural, because the plea is supported by conjectures or inferences. For example, "You did it, I did not." When, however, the issue is about a definition, it is called the definitional issue, because the meaning of the term must be defined in words. For example, "You did it, yes, but it wasn't theft." When the nature or quality of the act is examined, the issue is called qualitative, inasmuch as the controversy concerns the value of the action and its class or quality. For example, "You did it, yes, but I didn't mean to," or "I had to." But when the plea depends on the circumstance that it seems the right person does not bring the case, or that he brings it against the wrong person, or before the wrong court, or at the wrong time, under the wrong statute, or for the wrong charge, or with the wrong penalty, the issue is called translative, because the action appears to require a transfer to another court or a change in the form of pleading. One of these issues is necessarily applicable in every kind of case, for where none applies, there can be no controversy. The sources of proof. 300 years before Cicero's time, the Greek philosopher Aristotle, in his handbook on rhetoric, identified two kinds of available means of persuasion for winning one's case or argument, what he called non-artistic and artistic proofs. Non-artistic proofs are those that the speaker does not invent by using his art, for example, written contracts and the testimony of witnesses. Artistic means of persuasion, which the speaker does create by employing his art, are three in number: logos, rational argumentation; ethos, the presentation of character; and pathos, the arousal of emotions in the audience. Cicero adopts this Aristotelian schema, which we see reflected in the remarks made by Antonius, one of the chief characters of the orator, as he describes his approach in handling the initial stage of invention. "Well then, after accepting a case and acquainting myself with its category, the very first thing I do when I start working on the matter is to establish the point of reference for the whole portion of the speech that specifically concerns the judgment of the issue itself, that is, status. After that, I consider very carefully two further elements. The first one recommends us or those for whom we are pleading, the second is aimed at moving the minds of our audience in the direction we want. The method employed in the art of oratory, then, relies entirely upon three means of persuasion: proving that our contentions are true, that is, logos; winning over our audience, that is, ethos; and inducing their minds to feel any emotion the case may demand, that is, pathos. Now, for the purpose of proving, the orator has two kinds of material at his disposal. One consists of the things that are not thought out by the orator, but, inherent in the circumstances of the case, are treated methodically by him, such as documents, testimonies, agreements, evidence extracted by torture, laws, decrees of the Senate, judicial precedents, magistrates' rulings, legal opinions, and whatever else is not discovered by the orator, but is presented to him by the case and the parties involved. The other kind is that which entirely depends on the reasoning and argumentation of the orator. So in dealing with the first type, one must think about how to treat the arguments. With the second, about discovering them as well. De Orator 2.114-17. The so-called artistic means of persuasion, that is, those that are thought out or created by the speaker, often employ topics or commonplaces, loci communes in Latin. These are commonplace or stereotypical logical strategies or premises, the latter often ethical or political, upon which a speaker can build his logical arguments or his appeals to character and emotion. This idea that I began weaving just now, resumed Antonius, was leading up to the following conclusion, seeing that it is understood that all issues called into question depend not on the innumerable individual persons or unlimited variety of occasions, but on cases of a general kind and on the character of the categories involved, and further, that these categories are not only restricted in number, but are even very few. Those who are eagerly devoted to oratory should master the material belonging to each of the categories, marked, equipped with, and given distinction by all the commonplaces, that is, by subject matter and ideas. These by themselves will produce the words, which I, at any rate, always think sufficiently distinguished if they are such that the subject matter itself seems to have produced them. And if you want to know the truth, at least as I see it, for I can affirm nothing but my own view and opinion on the matter, we ought to bring this equipment of general, abstract cases with us into the forum. We should not be searching the commonplaces from which arguments can be unearthed only at the moment that a case has been entrusted to us, for surely everyone who has given them only moderate consideration can come to know such arguments in every detail through application and experience. At the same time, our minds must be directed back to those sources and to those commonplaces, as I have already called them, from which everything that can be discovered and invented for any speech is derived. In fact, the whole thing boils down to this: whether it is a matter of art or observation or experience, knowing the areas where you must hunt for, and track down, what you are trying to find. Once you have surrounded the entire place with the nets of your thought, at least if practical experience has sharpened your skill, nothing will escape you, and everything that is in the subject matter will run up to you and fall into your hands. De Orator 2, 145-47. Logos, rational argumentation. Rational argumentation has its foundation in two basic processes, induction and deduction. Speakers today still rely on these weapons of logic to win an argument, employing induction by the use of example and deduction through syllogistic reasoning. Examples, or analogies, can be fictitious or historical, and from them you can argue by inducing a probable conclusion about the matter in dispute, and then offer a general or universal application drawn from the specific example in question. Such arguments generally are tripartite in nature, first presenting one or more similar cases, second stating the point we want conceded, for which the similar cases have been cited, and third drawing a conclusion that reinforces the concession or demonstrates what results follow from it. A syllogism has the basic form of major premise, minor premise, and conclusion. For example, all human beings are mortal. Cicero is a human being. Therefore, Cicero is mortal. In speeches and oral arguments, a speaker often relies on premises that are probable and not necessarily certain, and sometimes even omits the minor premise, thus expressing the earlier syllogism in this way: Cicero is mortal, because all humans are. This sort of rhetorical syllogism is known as an enthymeme. In its most expansive, five-part form, called the epikyreme, a syllogism's major and minor premises are supported by further arguments, and then the conclusion is drawn. An entertaining argument demonstrating induction, that is, use of example or analogy, is related by Cicero in De Invention, 1.51-52. In the writings of Aeschines Socraticus, Socrates lays out an argument presented to Xenophon and his wife by Aspasia. Please tell me, Madam Xenophon, if your neighbor should have finer gold jewelry than you have, would you prefer hers or your own? Hers, she replied. What if she should have clothing and other feminine accessories that are more expensive than what you have? Would you prefer yours or hers? Hers, of course, she responded. Well, then, what if she should have a better husband than you have? Would you prefer yours or hers? At this the woman blushed. Then Aspasia initiated a conversation with Xenophon himself. Please tell me, Xenophon, if your neighbor should have a better horse than yours, which would you prefer, yours or his? His, he replied. What if he had a better farm than yours? Which farm would you prefer to have? The better farm, to be sure, he answered. Now, what if he should have a better wife than you have? Would you prefer his or yours? At this, Xenophon also fell silent. Then Aspasia said, Since each of you did not answer the one and only question to which I wanted an answer, I will tell you what each of you is thinking. You, wife, want to have the best husband, and you, Xenophon, want above all to have the finest wife. If, therefore, you cannot arrange it so that there be no better husband or finer wife on earth, you will surely be seeking eagerly what you think best, namely, that you be married to the best possible wife, and that she be wedded to the best possible husband. Here, since assent has been granted to statements that are undisputed, even the point that would seem in doubt when asked by itself is, by analogy, conceded as certain, because of the method employed in putting the question. In the following passage, De Invention 1.58-59, Cicero illustrates deductive reasoning in his outline of the Epicureme, the expansive, 5-part syllogism. Note, however, that in proving the major premise here, induction, that is, the use of example, is also employed. Those who think a syllogism should be argued in 5 parts say that the first part should state the thesis of the argument in this manner. Things that are done by design are managed better than those that are administered without design. They number this as the first part, and they believe that it should be substantiated by a variety of reasons and with great copiousness of expression, in this way. The household that is managed by careful planning is in all respects better equipped and better prepared than the one that is governed by chance and without a plan. The army that is commanded by a wise and skillful general is in all respects guided more advantageously than the one administered by someone's folly and rashness. The same reasoning can be applied to navigation, for the ship that employs the most knowledgeable helmsman completes its voyage most successfully. When the proposition has been proved in this way and 2 parts of the syllogism have been completed, they say that you should in the 3rd part, that is, the minor premise, state what you want to demonstrate, issuing from the thought of the major premise in this manner: of all things nothing is better governed than the universe. In the 4th part, they adduce another proof in support of this premise. For the risings and the settings of the constellations preserve a definite order, and the seasonal changes of the year not only occur necessarily always in the same way, but also agreeably to the advantage of all nature, and the alteration of day and night has through its changes in no respect ever harmed anything. These points are all proof that the nature of the universe is governed by some sort of extraordinary plan. In the 5th place, they draw the conclusion, which either merely states the inevitable deduction from all the parts, in this manner: therefore the universe is administered by design, or after briefly joining together the major and minor premises in one statement, they add what follows from them, in this way: therefore if those things that are governed by design are administered better than those that are governed without design, and of all things nothing is governed better than the universe, then the universe is governed by design. The 5-part argument, according to their thought, is structured in this way: ethos, argument based on character. The second mode or source of proof is ethos, or character, that is, persuasion gained through the effective presentation of the speaker's character or the character of the person on whose behalf the speaker is pleading. The goal is to win the approval and admiration of your audience, which makes them ultimately more sympathetic to your argument. Negative character portrayal of your opponent is also an effective way to help your listeners side with your point of view. In this passage from De Orator, on the ideal orator, 2.182-84, Cicero expounds on the effectiveness of persuasion achieved through character portrayal. Well then, the character, the customs, the deeds, and the life, both of those who do the pleading and of those on whose behalf they plead, make a very important contribution to winning a case. These should be approved of, and the corresponding elements in the opponents should meet with disapproval, and the minds of the audience should, as much as possible, be won over to feel goodwill toward the orator as well as toward his client. Now people's minds are won over by a man's prestige, his accomplishments, and the reputation he has acquired by his way of life. Such things are easier to embellish if present than to fabricate if totally lacking, but at any rate, their effect is enhanced by a gentle tone of voice on the part of the orator, an expression on his face intimating restraint and kindliness in the use of his words, and if you press some point rather vigorously, by seeming to act against your inclination, because you are forced to do so. Indications of flexibility on the part of the orator and the client are also quite useful, as well as signs of generosity, mildness, dutifulness, gratitude, and of not being desirous or greedy. Actually, all qualities typical of people who are decent and unassuming, not severe, not obstinate, not litigious, not harsh, really win goodwill, and alienate the audience from those who do not possess them. And these same considerations must likewise be employed to ascribe the opposite qualities to our opponents. But this entire mode of speaking is most effective in cases where there is not much opportunity to use some form of sharp and violent emotional arousal to set the juror's heart aflame. For we don't always have to employ vigorous oratory, but often we should rather speak in a quiet, low-keyed, and gentle manner. This is particularly effective in recommending parties to the audience. By parties, I mean not only those who are accused, but all those whose interests are at stake, for this is how the word was used in the old days. Portraying their characters in your speech, then, as being just, upright, conscientious toward the gods, subject to fear, and patient of injustice, is enormously influential. And if this is handled agreeably and with taste, it is actually so powerful, whether done in the prologue or when narrating the facts or when bringing the speech to its conclusion, that it often has more influence than the case itself. Moreover, so much is accomplished by speaking thoughtfully and with a certain taste, that the speech may be said to mold an image of the character of the orator, employing thoughts of a certain kind and words of a certain kind, and adopting besides a delivery that is gentle and shows signs of flexibility, makes speakers appear as decent, as good in character, yes, as good men. In most cases, ethical persuasion is presented subtly and throughout a speech. Cicero likens it to blood flowing through the entire body, and by the end of the speech or argument a particular portrait has been drawn for the hearers, both of the speaker and his opponent, and often others who have something to do with the argument or case in question. For example, in his defense of Roscius of Ameria, in 80 BC, who was charged with the heinous crime of murdering his own father, Cicero repeatedly and consistently portrays his client as a simple, frugal farmer whose character could never entertain the thought of a crime as atrocious as parricide. Roscius's adversaries, on the other hand, corrupted by their prodigality and prodded by their greed and audacity, are capable of any outrage, as he points out in this short passage from the middle of his speech. In this regard, I pass over what could have been an extremely powerful argument for me in maintaining Roscius's innocence: the fact that crimes of this sort are not generally born amid rustic manners, a frugal mode of living, a life rough and uncultured. Just as you cannot find every sort of crop or tree growing in every sort of soil, so every kind of life does not give birth to every kind of crime. The city breeds prodigality, and from prodigality greed necessarily develops, and from greed audacity bursts forth, from which all crimes and evil deeds are born. On the other hand, this rustic sort of life, which you call countrified, is the teacher of thriftiness, diligence, and justice. Pro Ratio Amarinos 75. A much more blatant use of character-based proof is evident in a speech from the time of Cicero's consulship in 63 BC. Toward the end of his year in office, Cicero uncovered a plot to overthrow the government, masterminded by Catiline, a nobly born but overly ambitious and unscrupulous senator, who had actually been one of Cicero's fellow competitors for the consulship in the previous year. After denouncing Catiline in a meeting of the Senate, Cicero spoke to the Roman people in public assembly, presenting them with the facts surrounding the conspiracy. In this speech, he makes blatant and unrestrained use of arguments based on character as he endeavors to draw a sharp comparison between himself and the loyal citizens of Rome and Catiline and his morally bankrupt followers. As is readily evident in this passage, in Catilinum 2.22-25, no subtlety is at play here, but something more akin to character assassination. Incidentally, it is worth noting that ad hominem attacks and proof based on character, which more often than not are excluded from our courtrooms, were not only permitted but even expected in the Roman setting. The final group is not only last in order but also in character and way of life, Catiline's own, of his own choosing, or rather sprung from his most intimate embrace. You see them with carefully coiffured hair, glistening with oil, some clean-shaven, others well-bearded, wearing ankle and wrist-length tunics, wrapped in togas that look more like sails. They drain all their life's energy and all the work of their waking hours in banquets that last until dawn. In these herds, you'll see all the gamblers, all the adulterers, all the dirty and disgusting lechers. These boys, so sleek and dainty, have learned not only to love and to be loved, not only to dance and sing, but even to brandish daggers and pour poison. If they do not leave Rome, if they do not perish, even if Catiline perishes, know that a breeding ground of Catilines will abide in the Republic. And yet, what do such wretches want for themselves? They are not going to bring their little girlfriends into camp with them, are they? But how will they be able to live without them, especially on nights like these? How will they endure the frost and snow of the Apennines? Unless, of course, they believe they will endure winter more easily because they have previously learned to dance at banquets in the nude. What an extraordinarily terrifying war it will be if Catiline will be leading this praetorian cohort of whores. Now, citizens, draw up your garrisons and armies against these outstanding troops of Catiline. First, post your consuls and generals against that wounded and worn-out gladiator. Next, lead out the flower and strength of all of Italy against that castaway, debilitated band of shipwrecked men. I have no need to compare your other resources, your equipment, your garrisons, with the poverty and neediness of that bandit. But if, leaving aside all of those things with which we are supplied and that man lacks, namely the Senate, the equestrian order, the city of Rome, the treasury, tax revenue, all of Italy, all of the provinces, if leaving aside all of these considerations, we are willing to compare the two causes that are in conflict, from this comparison alone we can understand how utterly prostrate our enemies lie. On our side fights modesty, on their side impudence, on our side decency, on theirs disgracefulness, on our side good faith, on theirs deceit, on ours dutifulness, on theirs criminality, on ours firmness of purpose, on theirs raving madness, on ours the honorable, on theirs the base, on ours continency, on theirs lust. Finally, justice, temperance, fortitude, prudence, all the virtues contend with injustice, prodigality, cowardice, imprudence, with all the vices. In sum, abundance fights against poverty, propriety against profligacy, sanity against madness, and well-founded hope against desperation in all things. In a contest and battle of this sort, even if men's enthusiasm should flag, would not the immortal gods themselves compel such a multitude of egregious vices to submit to these most outstanding virtues? Pathos, argument based on emotional appeal. The third source of proof is pathos, or persuasion won through appeal to the audience's emotions. The speaker's goal is to sway, or movere in Latin, the feelings of his listeners so that they will side emotionally with him. Appealing to the emotions is a tactic as old as speech itself, and the Greeks and the Romans employed both verbal and nonverbal appeals. One might recall that Socrates, in his defense called the Apology, asserted that he would not resort to emotional appeals, for example, bringing his children into the courtroom, dressed in mourning clothes, to secure his acquittal. Cicero realized the great power of argument based on emotional appeal, often calling it the most effective means of persuasion. For him, ethos involved knowledge and exploitation of the milder emotions, while pathos dealt with the more violent emotions. In De Orator, 2.185-87, the interlocutor Antonius continues with his description of pathos. Related to this, that is, ethos, though of a different order, is the other mode of speaking I mentioned, which stirs the hearts of the jurors quite differently, impelling them to hate or to love, to envy someone or to want his safety, to fear or to hope, to feel favor or aversion, to feel joy or grief, to pity or to want punishment, or to be led to whatever feelings are near and akin to those other such emotions. Of course, the most desirable situation for the orator is when the jurors themselves come to the case in an emotional state of mind, suited to what his own interests demand. For, as the saying goes, it is easier to spur on a willing horse than to rouse a sluggish one. But if this is not the case, or if the situation is rather unclear, then my method is that of a diligent doctor. Before attempting to apply treatment to a patient, he must find out, not only about the disease of the person he wants to cure, but also about his routine when healthy and his physical constitution. I do likewise myself, when I set out to work upon the emotions of the jurors in a difficult and uncertain case. I carefully concentrate all of my thoughts on considering, on scenting out as keenly as I can, what their feelings, their opinions, their hopes, and their wishes are, and in what direction my speech may most easily lead them. If they put themselves into my hands and, as I just said, are inclined, of their own accord, to lean in the direction I am pushing them, I accept what is offered and spread my sails to catch any breeze that happens to be blowing. If, however, the jurors are unbiased and unemotional, more effort is required, for then, the given situation offers no help, and all feelings must be stirred by my speech alone. But such enormous power is wielded by what one of our good poets rightly describes as soul-bending, the queen of all the world's speech, that it can not only straighten up someone who is bending over and bend over someone who is standing, but also, like a good and brave general, take prisoner someone who is offering resistance and fighting back. Antonius next goes on to assert that, in order to be most effective in stirring the emotions, the speaker himself should actually feel those emotions he hopes to evoke. He then describes his own appeal to pathos in one of the more famous examples of such pyrotechnics. Do not imagine that I didn't feel enormous grief in doing what I did when concluding my speech for Manius Aquilius, when I had to preserve his status as a citizen, for I remembered him to have been consul, to have been general, that he had been honored by the Senate, and had climbed the Capitol in celebration of his ovatio. So, when I saw him crushed, weakened, mourning, brought to the brink of disaster, I did not attempt to arouse pity in others before having been overwhelmed with pity myself. I clearly sensed that the jurors were especially moved at the point when I called forward the grieving old man, dressed in mourning clothes, and when I was prompted not by rhetorical theory, I wouldn't know what to say about that, but by my deep grief and passion, to do what you, Crassus, were praising. I ripped open his tunic and exposed his scars, that is, scars he had sustained fighting on behalf of the state. Gaius Marius, who was present at the trial among his supporters, strongly heightened the sorrow of my speech with his tears, and I, repeatedly addressing him, commended his colleague to his protection, and appealed to him to stand in defense of the common interests of generals. When I uttered these lamentations, and also had invoked all gods and men, all citizens and allies, it was not without shedding tears and feeling enormous grief myself. If there had been no grief in all of the words that I delivered on that occasion, my speech, so far from stirring pity, would actually have been ridiculous. De Orator 2.194-96. Cicero was well known for his effective use of pathos in his own speeches, often employing the grand style, full of emotion, to sway the jury in his client's favor. In the following passage, taken from the conclusion, or peroration, of his defense of his friend Plancius, Cicero pulls out all the emotional stops to secure the acquittal of his client, who was on trial for illegal election activities. A few years before the trial, when Plancius was stationed in Thessalonica, he offered shelter and support to Cicero, who had been exiled from Rome, a victim of the machinations of his arch-enemy Clodius. Throughout the speech, and especially here at its end, Cicero makes allusion to Plancius's aid to him in his hour of darkness, and links Plancius's current plight with his own situation while in exile. Oh, those watches of yours, Plancius, so wretched! Oh, those vigils full of tears! Oh, those bitter nights! Oh, that calamitous care for my life! If you, whom I could have aided perhaps by my death, cannot now receive help from me while I am alive, I remember, indeed I remember, nor shall I ever forget, that night when, in my misery, led on by false hope, I made empty, vain promises to you, as you sat by my side, watching and grieving with me, that I, if I were ever restored to my country, would repay your present kindness. But if fate should snatch life from me, or if some other force beyond my control should prevent my return, I promised that these men, for who else at that time was in my thoughts, would pay full recompense to you for all of your labors on my behalf. Why are you looking at me in that way? Why are you claiming my promises? Why are you imploring my good faith? I promised nothing to you then that was dependent upon my own resources. Rather, I made promises, relying on the benevolence of these men toward me. I knew that they were mourning for me, sighing for me, willing to fight for my life, even at peril to their own lives. When I was with you, I heard reports daily about their yearning, their sorrow, their laments, and now I fear that I can repay to you nothing beyond the tears you shed so bounteously for me amid my calamities. For what else can I do but grieve, but weep, but bind you by embrace to my own salvation? For the same people who granted salvation to me are able to grant it to you. But you, stand up, I beg. You I will hold and embrace. I profess myself to be not only an intercessor on behalf of your fortunes, but also your partner and ally. And there will be no one, I hope, so hard-hearted and inhuman, no one so forgetful, I will not say of my services to the patriots, but of their services to me, as to pull or tear from my side the savior of my person. I plead to you, jurors, not on behalf of one who has benefited from my services, but for one who is the guardian of my welfare. My weapons are not wealth, not authority, not influence, but prayers, tears, pity. And with me, this most excellent but wretched parent implores you, and we two fathers plead on behalf of one son. By you and your fortunes, by your children, I beg that you not willingly provide a source of joy to my enemies, especially those whom I incurred on behalf of your welfare, allowing them to boast that you, now forgetful of my welfare, stand as enemies of the man by whom that welfare was preserved. Do not shatter my spirit now with grief, and then again with the fear that your goodwill toward me has changed. Allow me from your store of graciousness to fulfill the promise that I, relying on you, often made to my client. Gaius Flavius, I beg and implore you earnestly, you who during my consulship were an ally of my plans, who shared in my dangers and helped with what I accomplished, and who always has wished not only for my safety, but for my honor and success, to do me the favor of saving, through the agency of this jury, the man through whose agency I, as you know, was saved to serve you in them. Your tears, and yours, jurors, not to mention my own, prevent me from saying more, tears that, in the midst of my great fear, suddenly give me hope that you will display the same disposition in saving my client as you did in saving me. For seeing your tears now calls to my mind those tears that you so often and so profusely have shed for me. Pro Plantio 101-4. Arrangement. Arrangement is the second part of rhetoric, or the second activity of the speaker. Now equipped with the subject matter for your argument or speech, having determined the issue at hand, thought out appropriate supporting arguments drawn from the sources of proof, and identified commonplaces through which to present these arguments, it is time to arrange or organize your speech appropriately into parts. By most accounts, a judicial speech in its basic form has 4 parts: an introduction or prologue, a narration or statement of the case, an argument including a refutation of opposing arguments, and a conclusion or epilogue. Deliberative speeches may sometimes assume a different structure. Moreover, at times a speaker might find it appropriate to add a proposition, a statement or division of his arguments, or a digression, an excursus on some related facet of the case, often on the character or actions of one of the principles involved. In De Orator 2.307-12, Cicero's interlocutor Antonius responds to an earlier comment from his friend Catullus, and gives advice on the arrangement of material. So let me now return to the subject that earned me your praise a little while ago. Catullus, the order and the arrangement of the material and the commonplaces. The principles involved are 2. One is inherent in the nature of our cases, the other is a matter of the judgment and good sense of the speaker. That we should say something before addressing the case, then set forth the case, after that prove it by establishing our own arguments and refuting those of our opponents, then conclude our speech and so bring it to an end. This is prescribed by the very nature of oratory. But to determine how we are to put together what we have to say in order to give proof and to instruct the jurors, that is the special province of the orator's good sense. For there are always many arguments that occur to us, many that seem likely to bring us advantage in our speech. Some of these, however, carry so little weight that they must be disregarded. Others, even if they offer some help, are often such that they contain some fault, while the value of the advantage that they seem to provide is not so great that it should be combined with some harmful point. But as to the useful and strong arguments, if nevertheless a great number of them remain, as often happens, then those among them that carry the least weight, or are rather similar to other, weightier ones, ought to be discarded, I think, and to be removed from our speech. It is at least my own practice, when I am assembling arguments for my cases, not to count so much as to weigh them. Also, as I have often said already, we bring people over to our point of view in 3 ways, either by instructing them, that is, logos, or by winning their goodwill, that is, ethos, or by stirring their emotions, that is, pathos. Well, one of these methods we should openly display, and we must appear to aim at nothing but giving instruction, while the other 2 must, just like blood in the body, flow throughout the whole of the speech. For it is essential that not only the prologues but also the other parts of a speech, about which I shall presently say a few words, should have the power to seep into the minds of the audience, as regards those 2 elements of a speech, which, though they do not provide instruction by argument, still accomplish a great deal by persuading and moving. It is true that both the introduction and the end of a speech are especially appropriate places for them. Nevertheless, it is often useful to digress from the proposition you are arguing in order to stir the emotions. Accordingly, after the case has been set forth in the narration, there is often room for inserting a digression aimed at stirring the emotions. Or this may well be done after our arguments have been proven or after those of our opponents have been refuted, or in both places, or in all parts of the speech, if there is enough importance and substance to the case. Actually, the cases that can best be amplified and given distinction, being weightiest and fullest, are exactly those that offer the most starting points for digressions of the kind that allow us to employ the commonplaces that drive on or deflect the audience's emotional impulses. Introduction or prologue, Latin exordium. The exordium, or prologue, of the speech is a passage designed to bring our audience into the proper state of mind in order to receive the rest of our argument. To accomplish this goal, the speaker should strive to secure the attention of his listeners, to make them receptive and ready to receive his arguments, and to win their goodwill. Ancient handbooks generally contain detailed descriptions of tactics that are effective in meeting these goals. Cicero's earliest extant oration, Pro Quinctio, on behalf of Quinctius, offers a fine example of an exordium, one particularly aimed at securing the sympathy and goodwill of his listeners, while at the same time disposing them unfavorably toward his opponents. The case is a relatively complicated one, involving a dispute over property possession. In his introduction, Cicero draws effective character sketches, that is, ethos, of those involved in the case: Naevius, the powerful and unscrupulous adversary; Hortensius, his patron, the eloquent and well-established orator; Quinctius, the poor, downtrodden defendant; and Cicero himself, Quinctius's patron, who is working at a great disadvantage, and whose abilities and experience pale in comparison to those of his opponent. In addition, Cicero's characterization of and appeal to Gaius Aquilius, chief assessor in the case, demonstrate his rather blatant efforts at securing the goodwill of his audience for the remainder of his speech. Two things that wield extraordinary power in the state, I mean great influence and eloquence, are both working against us today. One, Gaius Aquilius, causes me apprehension; the other fills me with dread. I am to a considerable degree bothered by the thought that the eloquence of Quintus Hortensius may hinder the effectiveness of my pleading this case. But I am in grave fear that the influence of Sextus Naevius may injure the cause of my client, Publius Quinctius. The possession of such advantages by our opponents to such a high degree would not seem so lamentable, if we possessed at least a modicum of either. But as it stands, I, who have insufficient experience and little natural ability, am matched against an advocate who is extremely skilled in speaking, while my client Quinctius, whose resources are scanty, who has no opportunities and only a meager contingent of friends, contends with a highly influential adversary. Moreover, we are working under yet another disadvantage, Marcus Junius, who has several times pleaded this case before you, who has great experience in other cases and has often and much been involved in this one, is prevented by his new appointment as legate from being here today. So, they had recourse to me, who, even if I were in consummate possession of other qualifications, have had scarcely enough time to be able to acquaint myself with the case, a case so important and complicated by so many disputed points. Thus, what has customarily been a help to me in other cases actually fails me in this one. For what I lack in natural ability, I have always made up for by my diligence, and how great this diligence is cannot really be appreciated, unless time and space have been granted. The more numerous these disadvantages are, Aquilius, the more receptive you and your fellow assessors should be to listening to our words, so that the truth, debilitated by so many unfavorable conditions, might finally be revived by the impartiality of such eminent men. But if you as judge seem unable to provide any protection to isolation and need in the face of power and influence, if, before this council, the case depends on resources rather than on truth, then certainly nothing sacred, nothing pure any longer exists in the state, nothing by which the authority and virtue of the judge can console the humbleness of an ordinary citizen. Undoubtedly, either truth will prevail before you and your fellow assessors, or repelled from this place by power and influence, it will be unable to find a place on which to stand. I do not speak in this way, Gaius Aquilius, because I doubt your trustworthiness and constancy, or because Publius Quinctius should not have the highest confidence in these most distinguished men of state whom you have called to assist you. What is it, then? First of all, the magnitude of the danger causes great fear in my client, seeing that all of his fortunes hang on this single judgment. And when he contemplates that fact, the thought of your power enters his mind no less often than that of your impartiality. For, as a rule, all those whose lives have been placed in the hands of another think more often about what the man under whose power and authority they find themselves is capable of doing, rather than what he ought to do. Second, Publius Quinctius has as his opponent Sextus Naevius in name, but in reality his opponents are men who are highly skilled in speaking, very bold, and most prosperous in our state, who defend Naevius with united efforts and vast resources, if defending actually means bowing to the desire of another party in order to be able the more easily to oppress anyone he wishes with an unfair trial. For what is more unfair or more disgraceful than the fact that I, who am defending the civil rights, the reputation, and the fortunes of the other party, should have to present my case first, especially when Quintus Hortensius, who in this trial assumes the role of an accuser, and whom nature has endowed with great talent and consummate fluency of speech, is going to speak against me. And so, it happens that I, who am obligated to ward off the weapons of the enemy and heal the wounds inflicted by them, am compelled to do so even before my adversary has launched any, while time is granted to them for staging an attack, when the power of avoiding their onslaught will have been snatched away from us, and when, if they hurl a false charge like some poisoned dart, as they are prepared to do, there will be no opportunity for us to apply a suitable antidote. Since Publius Quinctius, weakened and afflicted by so many and such great difficulties, has taken refuge in your trustworthiness, Aquilius, in your honesty, in your compassion, and since up to this point in time the power of his adversaries has made it impossible for him to find equal justice or the same ability to present his case or an impartial magistrate, and since, by supreme injustice, all things have become dangerous and hostile to him, he begs and implores you, Aquilius, and you, members of this council, to allow impartiality, jostled and tossed about by many acts of injustice, to stand firm and regain its strength at last in this place. Pro P. Quinctio 1-8-10. Narration or statement of facts, Latin narratio. The second major part of a speech is the narration, or statement of facts, Latin narratio. Facts, of course, can be a slippery term, and the notion of imparting spin to a story is as old as speech itself. Each speaker attempts to state his version of the facts of the case in a way that will be most beneficial to his argument. Rhetorical handbooks tell us that the ideal narration should possess three qualities: brevity, clarity, and persuasiveness or plausibility. One of the finest examples of an effective narration in Cicero's corpus of speeches comes from his defense of Titus Annius Milo, who was accused of murdering his rival Publius Clodius, the same Clodius who had earlier instigated Cicero's exile, as their two parties met on the Appian Way in January of 52 BC. While this meeting probably occurred by chance, Cicero is intent on showing that his client, the unsuspecting Milo, was ambushed intentionally by Clodius, who then happened to be killed in the fray by Milo's loyal servants. And in order that you might get a clearer view of this question, please listen carefully while I present a brief narrative of what transpired. Publius Clodius had determined to harass the state by every sort of criminal means during his praetorship. He saw that the elections of the previous year had been postponed to such an extent that he would be able to hold his praetorship for only a few months, and unlike others, he did not really have regard for the high honor of such a political office, but rather was only interested in Lucius Paulus, a citizen of singular merit, not serving as his colleague, and in having a full year in which to tear the state to pieces. So he suddenly transferred his candidacy from his proper year to the following year, not, as often happens, because of some religious scruple, but, as he himself was declaring, in order to have a full and unbroken year to exercise his praetorship, that is to say, to overthrow the state. It occurred to him that his praetorship would be crippled and debilitated were Milo to be elected consul, and he saw that Milo, by an overwhelming consensus of the Roman people, was, in fact, likely to become consul. He rushed to the support of Milo's fellow candidates, but on the condition that he himself alone should direct the entire campaign, even if he should act against their will, and that he would, to use his own words, carry the whole election on his own shoulders. He assembled the tribes, he interposed himself, he enrolled a new Colline tribe through a levy of the most profligate citizens. But the more he stirred up trouble, day by day the stronger Milo grew. When Clodius, supremely on the ready for every sort of crime, saw that bravest of men, his bitterest foe, was a sure bet to become consul, when he realized that this fact had been declared not only in gossip but also by the votes of the Roman people, then he began to work openly and declare plainly that Milo had to be killed. He had brought down from the Apennine slaves, brutish and barbaric, who had laid waste to the public forests and harassed Etruria. You often saw them. The matter was not at all kept secret, for he was declaring openly that, while the consulship could not be taken from Milo, at least his life could. He indicated this often in the Senate. He stated it in public meetings. What is more, when that very courageous man Marcus Favonius asked him what he hoped for in his frenzy, as long as Milo lived, he responded that Milo would be dead in 3, or at most 4 days. A remark that Favonius immediately reported to our friend here, Marcus Cato. Meanwhile, since Clodius learned, and it was not difficult to learn from the Lanuvians, that Milo, as honorary dictator of Lanuvium, had to make a journey there, obligatory by ritual and law, on January 18th in order to declare the election of a Flamen, he himself suddenly set out from Rome on the day before, in order that, as the sequel revealed, he might lay an ambush for Milo in front of his estate. What is more, he set out under the circumstance of having to leave an uproarious public meeting that was being held on that day, and that sorely missed his frenzied spirit, a meeting that he would have never left had he not wished to arrange with precision the time and place of his crime. Milo, on the other hand, having spent the entire day in the Senate until its dismissal, went home, changed his shoes and clothes, waited for a time while his wife was getting ready, as often happens, then set out at a point in time when Clodius could have already returned to Rome, had he actually intended to do so on that day. He was met by Clodius, unencumbered, on horseback, no carriage, no baggage, no customary Greek companions in his retinue, without his wife, which almost never happened. Our so-called conspirator here, on the other hand, who had allegedly planned that journey in order to commit murder, was riding in a carriage, dressed in a traveling cloak, accompanied by a huge, unwieldy, and largely female retinue composed primarily of maidservants and pages. He runs into Clodius in front of his estate at around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, or thereabout. Immediately several armed men, stationed on higher ground, make an attack on my client. Others, blocking the carriage, kill the coachman. But when Milo threw off his cloak, leapt from the carriage, and was defending himself with great courage, those who accompanied Clodius, with swords drawn, partly ran to the carriage in order to attack Milo from the rear, or partly, because they thought Milo had already been killed, began to cut down his slaves who were following. Among those slaves showing presence of mind and loyalty toward their master, some were killed, while others, when they saw the fight going on around the carriage and were prevented from helping their master, and when they heard from Clodius himself that Milo was killed and believed it to be true, Milo's slaves, for I will speak openly not in order to shift the charge, but to describe how it actually happened, Milo's slaves, I say, without the order or the knowledge or the presence of their master, did what everyone would have wished his own slaves to do in such a situation. Pro Milone 23-29. Confirmation or proof, Latin confirmatio. Proof of one's case, in which the orator relies chiefly on methods of rational argumentation for persuasion. See earlier, 19-24, generally follows the narration. On some occasions, the speaker may choose to introduce the confirmation with a partition, Latin partitio, in which he briefly outlines what his agreements are with his opponents and what is left in dispute, or more often, mentions in a methodical way what he intends to discuss in the proof. Cicero, in his De Invention, has this to say about the confirmatio. The confirmation or proof is that part of the speech through which our case gains credit, authority, and support through the marshalling of arguments. All propositions are confirmed in argument by attributes of persons or attributes of actions. We consider the following to be attributes of persons: name, nature, manner of life, fortune, habit, feeling, interests, purposes, achievements, accidents, speeches made. The attributes of actions are partly coherent with the action itself, partly considered in connection with the performance of the action, partly adjunct with the action, and partly consequent upon the performance of the action. But every argument drawn from these common topics that we have mentioned will have to be either probable or irrefutable. For, to define it briefly, an argument seems to be something devised in order to demonstrate a point with probability, or to prove it irrefutably. Those things are proved irrefutably that cannot happen or be proved otherwise than stated. The probable is something that generally is accustomed to happen, or that is generally among people's ordinary beliefs, or contains in itself some resemblance to these qualities, whether that resemblance be true or false. De Invention 1.34, 37, 44, 46. Cicero then goes on to elaborate on each of these categories and subdivisions. The following passage is taken from the Confirmatio of Cicero's speech on behalf of Milo, see earlier, 50-54. Recall that in defending his client Milo, who is charged with murdering Clodius, Cicero is endeavoring to prove that Clodius actually set the ambush for Milo, who was merely defending himself against attack. This passage illustrates several arguments that rely on the principles of proof and argumentation mentioned by Cicero earlier, particularly on the notion of probability. In that connection, Cicero earlier in the speech had invoked the famous legal maxim of Cassius Longinus, Cui bono? To whose advantage, or who stood to gain? A question invoked still today in court when attempting to establish the probability of motive. He resumes the theme here and continues with his arguments based on probability and advantage. Up to this point, gentlemen of the jury, I see that all the evidence points in one direction, that for Milo, it was actually advantageous for Clodius to continue to live, while for Clodius, the death of Milo was the realization of everything that he had so earnestly desired, that Clodius's hatred toward Milo was extremely bitter, while Milo harbored no hatred at all, that Clodius had made it a habit of relying on violence, while Milo was only in the habit of repelling it, that Clodius threatened and openly predicted Milo's death, while no such thing was heard from Milo. Clodius knew the day of Milo's departure, but Clodius's return was unknown to my client. Milo's journey was a matter of necessity, Clodius's was relevant to nothing. Milo had announced openly that he would leave Rome on that day, while Clodius had concealed that he would return on that day. No detail of Milo's plan was changed, while Clodius had fabricated a reason for altering his. Milo, if he were the one laying the ambush, would have had to wait for nightfall near the city, while Clodius, even if he had no fear of Milo, would still have had reason to fear approaching the city by night. Let us now examine the key factor in this whole affair, namely which party had a more advantageous position for an ambush in the place where they actually met. On this point, jurors, must we still continue to doubt and waste more time in thought? Was it in front of Clodius's estate, a place where, thanks to those insanely huge foundations, 1,000 able-bodied men were easily accommodated, that Milo judged he would have an advantage over his adversary who was stationed in a high commanding position, and so he accordingly chose that of all places for the fight? Was it not rather that my client was waited for at that very spot by one who, owing to his confidence in that location, had planned to make the attack there? Facts speak for themselves, gentlemen of the jury. Facts always powerfully prevail. If you were not hearing a narrative of these events, but rather were viewing them in a painting, it would still be patently clear which man was the one laying an ambush and which was the one harboring no evil designs. This one riding in a carriage, encumbered by a heavy cloak, and sitting next to his wife. Which of these could be more of a hindrance? Garment, vehicle, traveling companion? What could render someone less prepared for battle than to be entangled by a cloak, encumbered by a carriage, almost chained to a wife? Look now at Clodius, first proceeding from his villa, suddenly. Why, in the evening? Why was that a necessity? In a leisurely fashion, how does that fit, especially at that time of day? He was paying a visit to Pompeius's villa. Was it to see Pompeius? But he knew that Pompeius was at his place at Alsium. Was it to take a look at the villa? But he had been in that villa 1,000 times. What was it then? Nothing but delay and dilly-dallying. He didn't want to leave the spot until Milo should arrive. Next, please compare the mode of travel of this unencumbered hoodlum with Milo's baggage. Clodius had always before traveled with his wife. Now he is without her. Never before, except in a carriage. Now he is on horseback. Greek minions with him wherever he went, even when he was hurrying out to his Etrurian operations. Now no trace of such trifles in his retinue. Milo, who never bothered with such people, had with him on this occasion some of his wife's choristers and flocks of handmaids. Clodius, who always brought with him harlots, male prostitutes, and whores, on this occasion traveled with none other than those you would describe as hand-picked men. Why, then, was he defeated? Because the traveler is not always killed by the highwayman. Sometimes even the highwayman is killed by the traveler. And because, although a prepared Clodius had fallen upon the unprepared, Clodius himself nonetheless was a woman who had fallen upon men. Pro Milone 52-55. Refutation, Latin refutatio. Going hand in hand with proof of your case or argument is the refutation of your opponent's argument. then support for the case must be built by demolishing your opponent's arguments and by proving your own at the same time. For in every case, the portion of the speech that serves to establish your argumentation is, so to speak, based on just one principle. This portion does require both proof and refutation. But since you cannot refute the opponent's points without proving your own, nor prove your own without refuting your opponent's, it follows that these things are closely connected in terms of their nature, their usefulness, and their treatment. De Orator 2.331. In On Invention, Cicero outlines 4 ways by which to refute your opponent's argument. Every argument is refuted in one of these ways, if one or more of its assumptions is not granted, or if the assumptions are granted, it is denied that a conclusion can be drawn from them, or the actual form of argument is shown to be fallacious, or a strong argument is countered by one equally strong or stronger. De Invention 1.79. In 62 BC, Cicero defended a friend, former teacher, and native Greek, Archias, on a charge of claiming Roman citizenship falsely, a charge that, if proven, would have resulted in Archias's expulsion from Rome. In the following excerpt, Cicero refutes claims that have been made, or will likely be made by the prosecution. If the validity of Archias's citizenship and his compliance with the relevant law are the points at issue, I need say nothing more, the defense rests. For can you refute either of these points, Gradius? Would you deny that Archias was enrolled as a citizen at that time in Heraclea? Marcus Lucullus, a man of highest authority, scruple, and honor, is present. He testifies not that he thinks, but knows, not that he heard but saw, not that he was merely present but that he acted as agent. A delegation from Heraclea is present, highly distinguished men, who have come to Rome for this trial, with writs and public testimony, to declare that Archias was enrolled. At this point, my opponent asks for the public archives of Heraclea to be produced, archives we all know were destroyed in the burning of the record office during the war with the Allies. It is absurd to say nothing about the evidence that we have, but seek evidence that we cannot possibly obtain. 2. Remain silent about the record of living men, but demand a written record should be produced. And although you have at your disposal the scrupulousness of a very noble man and the sworn oath and testimony of an incorruptible municipality, to reject such things, which in no way can be corrupted, but ask for public records, which you yourself admit are regularly subject to tampering. Or do you deny that my client had established permanent residence in Rome, that is, the man who had, for so many years before he had been granted citizenship, made Rome the depository of all his property and fortunes? Or did he fail to register? On the contrary, he did register, and what is more, out of those declarations made then, his are the only ones from that registration and that board of magistrates that still have the authority of actual public records. For, although the citizen rolls of Appius were allegedly kept somewhat carelessly, and although all trustworthiness of such records had been impaired by the unreliability of Gabinius, yet Metellus, the most upright and scrupulous man of all, was so diligent in his record-keeping that he actually came to Lucius Lentulus the praetor, and a jury, and declared that he was deeply troubled by the erasure of a single entry. Here are the records, and you will see that there is no erasure by the name of Archias. You say that you search in vain for Archias's name on our census rolls. To be sure, I suppose it's a great secret that during the last census he was with the army as a staff member to the illustrious General Lucius Lucullus, and at the time of the previous census, he was with Lucullus again, who was then serving as quaestor in Asia, and previous to that, when Julius and Crassus were in office, no census of any section of the populace was held. But since the census roll does not confirm citizenship, and in fact merely indicates that one whose name is on the roll was then conducting himself in the manner of a citizen, please note that at that time my client, whom you allege, even in his own judgment, to have had no rights as a Roman citizen, had often made his will in accordance with Roman law, had entered upon inheritances left to him by Roman citizens, and had been recommended to the treasury for a reward by Lucius Lucullus, the proconsul. Search for arguments if you can find any, for Archias will never be convicted of falsehood, either by his own judgment, nor that of his friends. Pro Archia 8-11. Conclusion or epilogue, Latin conclusio or peroratio. The final part of a standard speech or argument is the conclusion or epilogue, during which you can sum up or recapitulate previous arguments and or stir the listener's emotions, either by exciting indignation against your opponent, or arousing pity or sympathy for you or your client. As a result, the epilogue is a favorite portion of a speech for employing pathos as a primary mode of persuasion. See earlier, 32 to 36. We have already included a pathos-laden passage from the epilogue of Cicero's speech on behalf of Plancius. See earlier, 36 to 40. The following excerpt comes from the peroration of Cicero's speech on behalf of his young protege, Marcus Tullius, delivered in 56 BC. Although Tullius was charged on 5 counts, including violence and attempted poisoning, Cicero based his defense to a large extent on arguing that the charges had actually been trumped up by a woman behind the scenes, Clodia, sister of Cicero's archenemy Clodius, see earlier, 50, who was, according to Cicero's account, Tullius's older, conniving, and vindictive ex-lover. Cicero argues that Tullius has sown his wild oats and is now ready to follow in his mentor's footsteps, assuming a role of leadership in the state. Noteworthy here, in addition, are Cicero's efforts at both stirring up indignation against Tullius's and Cicero's enemies, and evoking pity and sympathy by introducing into the court Tullius's elderly father. I have stated my case, jurors, and my speech has now come to its conclusion. You surely understand how weighty a verdict you are deliberating and how grave a matter has been entrusted to you. You are deliberating on a charge of violence, and the law concerning violence pertains directly to the power, to the majesty, to the condition of our country, to the safety of all. It is the law that Quintus Catullus proposed when there was an armed rebellion of citizens, at nearly the state's most desperate time. It is the law that, after the fire that blazed forth during my consulship, extinguished the smoldering embers of the conspiracy. It is now the same law by which the youthful life of Tullius is demanded for punishment, not by the state but by the depraved sport and caprice of a woman. Preserve for our country, therefore, jurors, a citizen of virtuous principles, a loyal citizen, a patriotic citizen. I promise you this, and this I pledge to the state, that, if I myself have served it well, he will never be separated from my way of thinking. And I can promise this, both relying on our close friendship and because he has now bound himself on the strictest of terms. One who has called into court an ex-consul, charging that he has violated the state, cannot himself be a seditious citizen in that state. Again, one who does not allow a man's acquittal on a charge of bribery to stand, cannot himself ever offer a bribe with impunity. Our state has 2 judicial accusations from Marcus Tullius, accusations that can be considered hostages against dangerous behavior on his part, or rather pledges of his goodwill. And so, jurors, I beg and plead with you that, in this state, where only a few days ago Sextus Cloelius was acquitted, a man whom, for the past 2 years, you have witnessed as either the servant or the leader of sedition, a man without property or credit, without hope or home or resources, a man whose tongue, hands, and entire life are foully polluted, who with his own hands burned down a sacred shrine, the depository of the census, the records of the Roman people, who inflicted damage on the monument of Catullus, tore down my house, and set fire to my brothers, who on the Palatine in view of the whole city incited slaves to murder and arson. In this same state, do not allow that man to have been acquitted through the influence of a woman, and Tullius to have been sacrificed to the passion of a woman, so that one and the same woman, in league with her brother and husband, does not appear to have both rescued the foulest of criminals and to have crushed the most honorable of youths. And when you consider the youth of Tullius, set before your eyes also the old age of this poor man, who relies on his only son, who is supported by his hope for him, who fears for his downfall. Mindful of the memory of your own parents, and the fondness you have for your own children, sustain this man, a suppliant of your mercy, prostrate not so much before your feet as he is before your hearts and sensibilities, so that, in the suffering of another, you might do service to your own sense of dutifulness and forgiveness. Do not willingly snuff out this old man's life, already naturally approaching its end, more quickly by your blow than by fate's, nor uproot, as if by some whirlwind or sudden tempest, this young man's life, now in its prime, blossoming with virtue. Save the son for the parent and the parent for the son, lest you seem either to have despised an old man, now almost desperate, or lest you appear not only not to have nourished, but actually to have crushed and destroyed a youth, full of highest hopes. If you preserve Tullius for me, for his own people, and for our state, you will have one who is pledged, devoted, and bound fast to you and to your children. It is you above all, jurors, who will reap the rich and abiding fruits of all of his energy and endeavors. Procelio 70, 77-80. Style. The third part of rhetoric, or the third activity of the orator, is style, Latin elocutio. After you have planned what to say, invention, and have decided on the order in which to say it, arrangement, you must decide how to say it, by casting your subject matter into language, actual words and sentences. The same subject matter can obviously be expressed in different words and in different manners, so the object of this third activity is to choose effective words and to connect those words into sentences, employing periodic structure, prose rhythm, an important consideration in ancient oratory, and figures of speech. In his De Orator, Cicero is emphatic about the inseparable bond between subject matter and expression, that is, between content and words. Verbiage that flows without having its origin in knowledge of the subject matter is empty and ridiculous, while even brilliant content can be obscured by a poor choice of words and their ineffectual connection. For since all discourse is made up of content and words, the words cannot have any basis if you withdraw the content, and the content will remain in the dark if you remove the words. Eloquence forms a unity, into whatever realms or areas of discourse it travels, whether it is speaking about the nature of the heavens or of the earth, or about divine or human nature, whether in trials, in the Senate, or from the rostra, whether its purpose is to urge people on or to teach them or to deter them, or to stir them or to curb them, or to kindle their emotions or to calm them, whether its audience be few or many, or strangers or one's friends or oneself. Speech is like a river, branching out into little streams, yet issuing from the same source, and in whatever direction it goes, it is attended by the same equipment and adornment. But we are now laboring under the opinions not only of the crowd, but also of half-educated people. They find it easier to deal with things they cannot grasp in their entirety, if they split them apart and almost tear them to pieces, and they separate words from thoughts just like a body from its soul, which in both cases can only wreak destruction. In my discussion, therefore, I will undertake no more than is assigned to me. I would only indicate briefly that discovering words for a distinguished style is impossible without having produced and shaped the thoughts, and that no thought can shine clearly without the enlightening power of words. De Orator 3.19, 22-24. There is, of course, no single style that is alone excellent, no single way of choosing words and configuring them into sentences that is superior to all others. Cicero recognizes this point and is emphatic in stressing that each speaker's individual strengths and weaknesses must be ascertained, and appropriate stylistic proclivities encouraged and developed in each case. Salutary advice for teachers still today. Between all of us here, then, there are great differences, and each of us has clear and specific traits. And amid this variety, the better is generally distinguished from the worse more by ability than by the type to which each belongs, and everything that is perfect in its own type is praised. So don't you think that if we chose to include all orators who are or have ever been active anywhere, we would have to say something like, as many orators, so many styles of speaking? Perhaps my argument will give rise to a further notion. If there is indeed an almost countless number of, let us say, forms and kinds of speaking, different in appearance but praiseworthy in their own types, then these mutually different things cannot be molded by the same rules and by one method of instruction. But this is not true. It is the responsibility of those who provide instruction and education to observe very carefully where each pupil's natural abilities seem to lead him. In fact, when we look at the schools, run by expert teachers who were superior in their own different types, we see that each one produced pupils who were different from one another and still praiseworthy, since every teacher adapted his instruction to the natural abilities of each individual pupil. The most striking example of this, to leave aside other arts, is probably that the incomparable teacher Isocrates said that he always used the spurs on Ephorus, but the reins on Theopompus. He checked the latter, who was unrestrained in his bold use of words, while he urged on the former, who was hesitant and modest, so to speak. Yet he did not make them alike. He added to the one and pared away from the other only as much as was necessary to reinforce in each what his natural abilities allowed. De Orator 3.34-36. Discussions concerning style in Cicero's time were usually organized either around the four qualities or virtues of style as defined by Aristotle's student Theophrastus, or according to three or more types or characters The virtues of style are the correct use of Greek, or Latin in Cicero's case, English, in ours, clarity, distinction, ornamentation, which includes tropes such as metaphors, figures of speech, and figures of thought, and appropriateness. The best known categorization of types, or characters, of style is the threefold division into plain, middle, and grand virtues of style, correctness and clarity. In De Orator 3.37-41, 48-49, Cicero's interlocutor, Crassus, speaks briefly about the first two qualities of style and makes it clear that all literate speakers are already in possession of these virtues, though study and further reading of the orators and poets will strengthen and enhance them. And tell me, is there a better way of expression than to speak correct Latin, clearly, with distinction, and in a manner that is suitable and appropriate to the particular matter at issue? Now I don't think that I am expected to give an account of the two elements that I mentioned first, pure and lucid language, for we do not attempt to teach someone to speak who doesn't know how to talk, and we cannot hope, if someone cannot speak correct Latin, that he is going to speak with distinction, or, for that matter, if someone cannot say something that we might understand, that he will be able to say something that we might admire. Still, every aspect of refined diction, though it can be polished by a knowledge of grammar, can nonetheless be developed by reading the orators and the poets. For almost all of the ancients, though they were not yet able to impart distinction to what they said, expressed themselves very well, and people who have become accustomed to their language cannot fail to speak anything but correct Latin, even if they should try. This is not to say that we should employ the words that are not employed in normal usage anymore, except sparingly, for the sake of imparting distinction to what we say, as I will point out later. But in the employment of words in common use you will be able to use the choicest among them if you have thoroughly and devotedly immersed yourself in the writings of the ancients. But in order to speak correct Latin, we must not only be careful to utter words that no one might justifiably criticize, and to use them in the proper case, tense, class, and number, so that there is no confusion, want of agreement, or incorrect order, but we must also control our tongue, our breath, and the actual sound of our voice. I don't like letters to be over-articulated with too much affectation, and I don't like them to be obscured by being pronounced too carelessly. I don't like words to sound thin by being pronounced with too little breath, and I don't like them to be puffed up and uttered, as it were, with too full and heavy a breath. Let us, then, pass over the rules for speaking correct Latin, which are taught in our elementary lessons, fostered by a more precise, systematic knowledge of grammar, or by the practice of daily conversation at home, and strengthened by books and the reading of the ancient orators and poets. And really, let us not spend more time on the second point, on discussing in what ways we can see to it that what we say will be understood, obviously by speaking correct Latin, by employing words in common use that properly designate the things we want to be signified and indicated, by avoiding ambiguous words or language, excessively long periodic sentences, and spun-out metaphors, by not breaking up the train of thought, confusing the chronology, mixing up people, or muddling the order. Distinction, ornamentation. The third quality of style, distinction or ornamentation, traditionally received the most attention by ancient rhetorical theorists. Included in this category are things such as tropes or turnings, that is, substitutions of one term for another as in metaphor, changes in the sequence or sounds of words, that is, figures of speech such as alliteration or anaphora, figures of thought such as rhetorical question, designed to emphasize a thought or involve the audience more directly, and cadence and rhythm, the effective arrangement of our words to render not strict metrical patterns, but rhythms that make our prose pleasing to the ear. As mentioned earlier, Cicero felt strongly that style must be rooted firmly in content. In fact, that it actually resides in content, rather than being something that is applied artificially like cosmetics. And like all things that are truly distinctive, judicial use and tasteful variation are the secrets to a truly distinctive style. Distinction, then, is imparted to a speech in the first place by its general character, and its own particular complexion and vitality, as it were, that it should be weighty, charming, and learned, that it should be well-bred, admirable, and accomplished, and that it should contain as much feeling and emotion as necessary. This is not a matter of the individual limbs, but these qualities are discerned in the body as a whole. That it should, as the next point, be sprinkled, as it were, with flowers of language and thought, This is a quality that must not be spread evenly throughout the entire speech, but must be distributed here and there in the way that decorations and lights are arranged when a public place is adorned. We must, then, choose a general character for our speech that will do most to hold the attention of our audience, and that not only delights them, but does so without causing satiety. It is difficult to say why the very things that most stir our senses with pleasure and rouse them most strongly when we first encounter them are also the quickest to give us feelings of aversion and satiety, and thus to alienate us. How much brighter than old paintings are most of the modern ones, with their beauty and variety of color. Yet, even if they captivate us at first glance, they do not delight us much longer, whereas, on the contrary, our attention is held precisely by the roughness and the fainter colors of ancient paintings. In singing, how much softer and more delicate are the coloratura and falsetto notes than unadorned ones firmly held. Yet, not only people of more austere tastes dislike them, but even the crowd shouts its disapproval if they are heard too often. You can also see this in the other senses. Perfumes with an intense and penetratingly sweet scent do not delight us for so long as the moderately sweet ones, and what seems to have the fragrance of wax receives more praise than what hints of saffron. Even with the sense of touch, there is a limit to softness and smoothness. Yes, even our taste, the sense that is most responsive to pleasure, and that is roused by sweetness more than the other senses. How quickly does it spurn and reject what is intensely sweet? Surely nobody can take sweet food or drink for too long? But both food and drink that affect this sense with only light feelings of pleasure quite easily avoid causing feelings of satiety. Since in everything else, then, the greatest pleasure borders on aversion, we need not be too surprised by this phenomenon in the case of speech. Here, our experience with poets as well as orators allows us to conclude that poetry or prose that is elegant, decorated, distinguished, and pretty, but continuously so without new starts or variety, cannot give delight for a very long time, however vivid the colors in which it is painted. In fact, people take offense more quickly at the curls and cosmetics of an orator or poet. For the following reason, satiety of the senses stemming from excessive pleasure is a matter of nature, not of the mind, while in the case of the written and the spoken word, faults of overcoloring are not only recognized through the judgment of the ears, but even more through that of the intellect. Accordingly, I don't mind hearing people say, "Great!" and "Outstanding!" about us however often, but I don't like to hear "Charming!" or "How pretty!" too often. Certainly, the popular exclamation, "Couldn't be better!" I would want to hear repeatedly. All the same, such admiration during a speech, this highest praise, should have some areas of shade and some recesses, so that what is highlighted can be seen to stand out more prominently. De Orator 3.96 to 101, Appropriateness. The fourth quality or virtue of style is appropriateness or propriety, that is, fitting to your speech or argument the most appropriate style for that particular occasion, opponent, or audience. It is, of course, obvious that no single style is fitting for every case or every audience, or every person involved or every occasion. Cases in which someone's civic status is at issue require one specific tone, while private and insignificant cases require another. Deliberative speeches, laudatory speeches, lawsuits, conversations, consolations, rebukes, discussions, and the writing of history all demand different styles. It also makes a difference who our audience is, whether it is the Senate, the people, or a jury, whether it is large, small, or an individual, and what sort of people they are. The speakers themselves must also be considered, their age, their prestige, and how much authority they possess. As to the occasion, is it peace or war, is there some urgency or is there room for a leisurely approach? So it seems that there is really no rule that I could give you at this point, except that when choosing a type of speech, a fuller or a more slender one, or indeed the middle type, we should see to it that it is adapted to the problem at hand, and we may in each case employ approximately the same elements for imparting distinction, sometimes more energetically, at other times in a lower key. In every area, the capacity to do what is appropriate is a matter of art and natural ability, but to know what is appropriate at each time is a matter of good sense. De Orator 3.210-12. In his Orator, 70-74, Cicero elaborates on this point in a more philosophical and reflective manner. The foundation of eloquence, just as of everything else, is wisdom. In a speech, just as in life, nothing is more difficult than to discern what is appropriate. The Greeks call it prepon, let us call it appropriateness. Many brilliant precepts have been handed down about this, and this subject is most worthy of our consideration. Ignorance of what is appropriate causes mistakes not only in life but very often also in poetry and public speaking. Moreover, the speaker must pay attention to appropriateness not only in his thoughts, but also even in his words. For not every station in life, not every rank, not every position, not every age, nor every time or place or audience should be treated with the same style of words or thoughts. In every part of our speech, as in every part of life, we must consider what is appropriate, and this depends on the subject matter that is being discussed as well as on the characters of the speakers and the listeners. Thus, the philosophers are accustomed to treat this extensive topic under the subject of moral duties, though not when they are discussing absolute virtue, for that is one and unchanging. Teachers of literature consider it in connection with poetry, eloquent speakers in dealing with every kind and every part of their case. How inappropriate it is to employ general topics and amplified language when, before a single judge, you are pleading a case about the drainage of rainwater, or to use a low-key, submissive tone when speaking about the majesty of the Roman people. These err in every respect, while others make a mistake in terms of character, either their own, or that of the jurors, or of their opponents, and not only in substance but often in the use of words. Although a word has no force apart from the same thing is still often either approved or rejected depending on its being expressed by one word or another. And in all cases, the question must be, how far? For, although each subject has its own limits of appropriateness, too much is generally more offensive than too little. And Apelles used to say that those painters who do not have a sense of what is enough also make the same mistake. But if the poet avoids inappropriateness as the greatest fault, and even makes a mistake when he places the speech of an upright man in the mouth of a villain or that of a wise man in the mouth of a fool, or if a painter, in a scene of the sacrifice of Iphigenia, when he has portrayed Calchas as sad, Ulysses as more sad, and Menelaus as grieving, recognizes that Agamemnon's head must be veiled since his supreme sorrow could not be captured by his brush. If finally even the actor searches for what is appropriate, what then do we think the orator should do? Since this is of such importance, let the orator consider what to do in his cases and in their various parts. It is certainly obvious that not only the different parts of a speech, but even entire cases must be handled now in one style, now in another. Types or characters of style. An alternative way to discuss style was to classify it according to various types or characters, most commonly three: the plain, middle, and grand. Cicero employs this classification in the order, but takes it a step further by adding a unique and original variation. He correlates the Aristotelian artistic sources of proof, logos, ethos, and pathos, see earlier, 15-17, with the Latin verbs probare, to prove, delector, to delight or to charm, and flectere, to sway, and identifies each with one of the stylistic types. The eloquent speaker whom we seek will be the one who will speak in the forum and the courts in such a way as to prove and to delight and to sway. To prove is a necessity, to delight adds charm, to sway brings victory, for of all things this one is the most potent weapon for winning cases. For these three functions of the speaker there are three styles: the plain style for proving, the middle style for delighting, and the vigorous style for swaying, and in this last resides the full force of a speaker. The one who manages and, as it were, combines these three different styles will need to be in possession of keen judgment and very high ability, for he will judge what is required in any situation, and will be able to speak in whatever way the case demands. Order 69-70. While it is clear that Cicero favors the grand style as the one that possesses the most power and persuasive weight, he insists that the best speakers should be masters of all three styles, knowing how and when to employ each, and how to modulate them accordingly. A steady diet of the grand style, for example, will only lead to disaster. The speaker of the grand style is abundant, copious, stately, and distinctive, and he certainly wields the greatest power. For this is the speaker whose distinctiveness and fluency of speech have caused admiring nations to allow eloquence to hold sway in the state. And this is the sort of eloquence that rushes on its course with a mighty roar, that all extol, that all admire, that all despair of attaining. This eloquence plies the hearts of people and moves them in every possible way. This eloquence now shatters the senses, now insinuates itself into them. It sows new ideas and uproots firmly planted ones. But there is a great difference between this style and the others. One who has worked diligently on the plain and incisive style so as to speak with skill and accuracy, and has not contemplated anything higher, is, in respect to the perfection of this single style, a great orator, though not the greatest. He will not find himself on slippery ground, and, once he has taken a stand, he will never fall. The speaker of the middle style, whom I call moderate and tempered, will not fear the doubtful and uncertain hazards of speaking, provided he has deployed his forces satisfactorily. Even if, as often happens, he is not completely successful, he still will not be in great danger, for he cannot fall very far. But this speaker of ours whom we deem the chief, stately, fierce, and fiery, if he has inborn talent for this alone, or has trained himself in this one style, or has studied only this and does not temper his copiousness with the other two styles, is much to be despised. For the speaker in the plain style, because he speaks accurately and adroitly, is considered wise. The one employing the middle style is charming. But the very copious speaker, if there is nothing else to him, tends to appear insufficiently sane. For someone who can say nothing calmly, nothing mildly, nothing in an organized way, precisely, distinctly, or wittily, especially when some cases demand such treatment entirely, and others largely so, if he begins to inflame the situation without first preparing the ears of his audience, he appears to be nothing more than a raving maniac among the sane, a drunken reveler in the midst of the sober. Order 97-99. The Rhetorica ad Herennium or Rhetoric to Herennius was preserved among the works of Cicero and was, for a millennium, believed to be from his hand. Scholars from the Renaissance on, however, realized that the work was not authored by Cicero, though its content and date are, in fact, very close to those of Cicero's youthful work, De Invention. In any case, the anonymous author of the Ad Herennium classifies style according to the categories of grand, middle, and plain, and gives the following examples of each. A speech will be composed in the grand style if for each and every idea the most distinctive words that can be found, whether literal or figurative, are employed, and if impressive thoughts, such that are used in amplification and appeals to pity, are chosen, and if we apply figures of thought and speech, which have weightiness. Here is an example of this type of style. Who is there among you, jurors, who can think up a suitable punishment for him who has thought how to betray his country to our enemies? What evil-doing can be compared to this crime? What punishment can be found worthy of this evil-doing? On those who had done violence to a freeborn youth, who had raped the mother of a family, who had wounded, or even killed someone, our ancestors expended their greatest punishments. For this most ferocious and nefarious crime they left us no specific penalty. In other evil-doing, injury arising from another's crime extends to an individual, or to only a few, but those complicit in this crime are, in one plot, devising the most atrocious disasters for all citizens. Oh, such savage hearts! Oh, such cruel designs! Oh, such humans devoid of all humanity! What have they dared to do, or what can they be planning? They are planning how our enemies, after tearing up the graves of our ancestors and throwing down our walls, will rush in against our city with shouts of triumph. How, after the temples of the gods have been despoiled, the patriots butchered, others hauled off into slavery, mothers of families and freeborn youths subjected to enemy lust, the city, put to the torch in a most violent conflagration, will fall. They do not think they have accomplished the result they desire, unless they have looked upon the pitiable ashes of our most holy homeland. I cannot capture in words, jurors, the vileness of the thing, but I am rather unconcerned about it, because you have no need of me. Indeed, your own spirit, full of patriotism for the Republic, indisputably instructs you to cast out this man, who wanted to betray the fortunes of all, headlong from the state, which he wanted to bury under the nefarious domination of the filthiest of enemies. A speech will belong to the middle type if we have relaxed our style to some degree, but still have not descended to the most ordinary prose, as follows. You see, jurors, against whom we are waging war, against allies who have been accustomed to fight on our behalf and with us to preserve our empire by their virtue and industry. These men necessarily knew their own capabilities, supplies, and resources, but also, because of their nearness to us and their alliance with us in all affairs, they were no less able to know and assess the power of the Roman people in every respect. When they had made the decision to wage war against us, on what, I ask you, did they rely in presuming to undertake the war, since they realized that the vast majority of our allies were remaining faithful to their obligation, and since they saw that they had no multitude of soldiers, no suitable commanders, and no public money, in short, none of the things essential for carrying on a war, even if they were waging a war with their neighbors over their boundaries, or even if they believed that the entire contest hinged on one battle, they would still come to the fight better prepared and better equipped in every way. It is even less conceivable that with such a tiny force at hand they would attempt to transfer to themselves sovereignty over the whole world, a sovereignty to which all nations, kings, and races have submitted, in part through force, in part through their own will, when conquered either by the arms or the generosity of the Roman people. What about the Fragellans? Someone will ask. Did they not make such an attempt on their own initiative? Indeed they did. But these allies would make such an attempt less readily because they saw how things turned out for the Fragellans. For those without experience in things, who are unable to find precedents for every circumstance in events that have transpired previously, are through imprudence very easily led into error. But those who know what has happened to others can, from events that have affected these others, easily provide for their own affairs. Have they, therefore, taken up arms, induced by no motive or relying on no hope? Who could believe this? That anyone had been seized by so much insanity as to dare, relying on no forces, to assail the sovereignty of the Roman people. Some motive, therefore, must have necessarily existed, and what else can it be but what I claim? The following will serve as an example of the plain style, which is lowered to the level of everyday speech. Our friend here happened to enter the baths, and after he washed, started to be rubbed down. Next, when he decided to get into the tub, this guy turns up out of nowhere. "Hey there, young fellow, your slaves just now gave me a pummeling, and you better make good on it." The young man blushed, for at his age he was not used to being called out by name by a total stranger. This guy began to repeat the same thing, but more loudly, and to add other things. The youth was barely able to reply, "Okay, let me look into it." But then this creep cries out in that tone of his that would easily cause anyone to blush, so pert and harsh, such as you would hear, if you asked me, not even in the neighborhood of the sundial, but backstage and in other such places. The youth was upset, and no wonder, seeing that up till now his young ears were used to scoldings by his tutor, not wranglings of this sort. For where would our young man have seen such a stooge, who had forgotten how to blush and who thought that he had nothing left to lose from his good name, so that he could do anything at all without detriment to his reputation? The types of style, therefore, can be understood from the examples themselves. For one arrangement of words is of the plain style, another belongs to the grand, and another to the middle. Rhetorica ad Herennium 4.11-15. In his orator, Cicero offers 3 of his own speeches as examples of the plain, middle, and grand style. My defense on behalf of Caecina, pro Caecina, concerned itself entirely with the words of the praetor's provisional order. We explained complicated matters through the process of definition, praised the civil law, and drew distinctions between ambiguous terms. In the Manilian law, pro leg Manilia, glorification of Pompey was the goal. We set forth that glorification richly with a speech in the middle style. My defense of Rabirius, pro Rabirio, was involved with all aspects of the principle of upholding the dignity of the state. In this speech, therefore, we blazed forth in every manner of rhetorical amplification. Orator 102. In the following extract from his speech on behalf of Caecina, Cicero employs the plain style as he endeavors to demonstrate the inadequacy of words in describing complicated or subtle legal concepts. The spirit of the law must take precedence over its letter. What statute, what senatorial decree, what edict of magistrates, what treaty or agreement or, to return to private concerns, what will, what judgments or covenants or pacts or formal agreements cannot be invalidated and torn apart, if we are willing to reduce their meaning to mere words, while abandoning the design, the intention, and the authority of those who wrote them. Believe me, our familiar everyday speech will lack all coherence if we set traps with words for one another. Cannot each and every one of you come up with some example, in one connection or another, that bears witness to the contention that right does not depend on words, but that words are in the service of people's designs and intentions? Shortly before I became active in the Forum, Lucius Crassus, by far the most eloquent of men, defended this opinion amply, distinctively, and indisputably. And although that very wise man Quintus Mucius Scaevola was speaking on the other side of the case, Crassus proved to everyone that Manius Curius, who had been named heir in the event of the death of a posthumous son, was entitled to be named heir although the son was not dead, since, in fact, a son had never been born. Well, did the wording of the will provide sufficiently for such a situation? Not in the least. Then what was the deciding factor? Intention, for if our intentions were able to be understood while we remained silent, we would not use words at all. But because this is not possible, words have been invented, not to conceal but to reveal intention. By statute, 2 years' possession determines property in land, but we employ the same principle in dealing with buildings, which are not specifically named in the statute. By statute, if a road is impassable, a person can drive his beast of burden by any road he chooses. Relying merely on the wording, this could be taken to mean that if a road in Bruttium is impassable, a person may, if he chooses, drive his beast of burden through Marcus Scaurus's estate at Tusculum. A form of action can be brought against the vendor, if present in court, beginning with these words: "Since I see you in court." The legendary Appius Claudius, who was blind, could not use this form of action, if in court people adhered literally to the words without considering the actual meaning that the words are meant to express. If, in a will, Cornelius the minor had been named the heir, and Cornelius were now 20 years old, he would lose his inheritance according to your interpretation. Pro Caecina 51-54. In 66 BC, the year of Cicero's praetorship, Gaius Manilius, one of the tribunes, proposed a law granting the general Pompey supreme command over the province of Asia, that is, Asia Minor, and in the war against Mithridates, king of Pontus. Cicero spoke in favor of the law, and he later cites this speech as a prime example of the middle style. His task, as he says, was to praise the character and ability of the general, a sample of which we see in the following passage. Come, now, consider the moderation that characterizes Pompey in other situations. On what do you think he has founded that great quickness of his and that incredible speed of movement? For it was not the extraordinary power of his oarsmen, nor some unheard of skill in navigating, nor some strange winds that brought him so quickly to the remotest of lands. Rather, it was the fact that the things accustomed to delay others did not slow him down. Greed did not lure him from his appointed course to some sort of plunder, nor lust to some desire, nor pleasant prospect to some delight, nor the fame of some city to its investigation, nor labor itself to the opportunity for rest. Finally, as to the statues and paintings and other adornments of Greek towns that the majority of generals think should be carried off, Pompey judged that he should not even view them. Now, for these reasons, all people in those places look upon Gnaeus Pompeius as someone not sent from this city, but as one come down from heaven. Now at last they are beginning to believe that there were once Romans who were characterized by this sort of self-control, something that already seemed incredible to foreign nations, and merely attributable to a mistaken memory. Now the splendor of your empire has begun to shed its light on those peoples. Now they understand that it was not without cause that their ancestors in those days, when we had magistrates of similar moderation, preferred to serve Rome rather than to rule others. Now, indeed, access to him by ordinary people is said to be so easy, the lodging of complaints over wrongs committed by others so open, that he who excels princes in terms of dignity seems to be equal to the lowliest in terms of accessibility. Now, how powerful he is in council, how powerful he is in the weight and eloquence of his oratory, which in itself is indicative of the dignity that is appropriate to a general, you have often, fellow citizens, had the opportunity to recognize in this very place. And his trustworthiness, how greatly do you think this is esteemed by our allies, when every enemy of every race has judged it absolutely unimpeachable. Now, he is marked by such humanity that it would be difficult to say whether warring enemies feared his valor more than the vanquished esteemed his clemency. Indeed, will anyone doubt that the conduct of such a great war should be entrusted to this man, who seems by some sort of divine design to have been born to bring all the wars within our memory to a conclusion? Pro Leg Manilia 40-42. In 63 BC, the year of Cicero's consulship, an aged senator, Gaius Rabirius, was indicted on a charge of high treason for actions that allegedly occurred some 36 years earlier. The charge was actually aimed at debilitating the authority of the Senate and consuls, and Cicero, now himself a consul and a staunch supporter of senatorial authority, speaks in Rabirius's defense. The introduction, exordium, of the speech, marked by its serious and solemn tone, striking rhetorical figures, amplification, and stately periodic structure, presents a good example of the grand style. Although, fellow citizens, it is not customary for me, as I begin speaking, to render an account of my reasons for defending a particular client, for I have always considered the perilous situation of any citizen standing trial a sufficient reason for my bond with him. Nevertheless, in this, my defense of Gaius Rabirius's life, reputation, and fortunes, it appears necessary to set forth a rationale of my services to him, for my reason for defending him, which seems to me to be most just, should to you seem the same for acquitting him. To be sure, the longevity of our friendship, the high standing of my client, the demands of human kindness, and the practice that I have followed my entire life have urged me to defend Rabirius. But the welfare of the Republic, my duty as consul, indeed the consulship itself, commended to me by you along with the welfare of the Republic, have compelled me to defend him most zealously. Certainly it is not the guilt attached to the charge, nor jealousy of his life, nor the deep, long-standing, even just, enmity felt by private citizens that has summoned Gaius Rabirius to court on a capital charge. Rather, in order to remove from the Republic the chief bulwark of its imperial majesty handed down to us by our ancestors, so that from this point on neither the authority of the Senate, nor the power of the consuls, nor concord among good citizens would have any potency. For this reason, I say, amid the overturning of these institutions, the old age, the infirmity, and the isolation of this one man have been assailed. If, therefore, it is the mark of a good consul, when he sees all the supports of the Republic shaken and torn apart, to bring aid to the country, to rush to secure the welfare and fortunes of all, to plead for the loyalty of the citizens, and to consider the public welfare before his own, it is also the mark of good and courageous citizens, such as you have shown yourselves in all crises of the Republic, to block all paths to sedition, to fortify the bulwarks of the Republic, to consider that supreme power resides with the consuls, and supreme deliberative power with the Senate, and to judge that he who has adhered to these principles is worthy of praise and honor rather than condemnation and punishment. Wherefore, while the task of defending Rabirius is chiefly mine, eagerness to save him will have to be shared by me along with you. For you should understand, fellow citizens, that never in human memory has a case more important, more dangerous, more worthy of your caution been undertaken by a tribune of the people or resisted by a consul or referred to the Roman people. For this case is being undertaken, fellow citizens, for no other reason than to ensure that from this day forward there be no general council in the Republic, no concord among good citizens against the fury and audacity of wicked men, no safe haven for the Republic when in dire straits, no bulwark for its welfare. Since this is the situation, because duty demands it when engaged in such a monumental struggle on behalf of a man's life, reputation, and all his fortunes, first beg of Jupiter, most high and mighty, and of all the other immortal gods and goddesses to grant peace and favor, and I pray that they have allowed this day to dawn for the purposes both of preserving the welfare of my client and of setting strong the foundations of the Republic. Next I beg and implore you, fellow citizens, whose power most closely approximates the divine will of the immortal gods, since at one and the same time the life of the very hapless and innocent Gaius Rabirius, as well as the welfare of the Republic are entrusted to your hands and to your votes, to apply your accustomed mercy in regard to the fortunes of my client, your accustomed wisdom in regard to the welfare of the Republic. Pro Rabirio 1-5. Memory. Memory is the fourth part of rhetoric, or activity of the orator. Speakers in our modern world can have recourse to written texts, computer screens, and teleprompters to help them in the delivery of their speech, discourse, or argument. In such an environment, we tend to forget that the ancient orator depended almost entirely upon memory when arguing a point or delivering a speech. Difficulty in manipulating ancient writing materials, the awkwardness of handling scrolls, the expense of written materials and lack of indices, along with an absence of modern audiovisual electronic equipment, made dependence on one's memory a given in Cicero's day. Even though some of the stories about prodigious feats of memory from antiquity might be subject to hyperbole, it is certain that the ancients were called upon to use and exercise their memories to a much greater extent than are we. For example, a speaker of Cicero's ability and reputation could deliver a speech that lasted several hours, all from memory. Ancient theorists identified two types of memory, natural and artificial. Natural memory is the memory that is embedded in our minds and simultaneously occurs with our thought. Artificial memory is memory that comes from art or technique, that is, memory that is strengthened by training and discipline. In that connection, an elaborate system of localities and images was developed for the purpose of enhancing artificial memory. In order to recall a series of facts or details, one would choose a familiar location, for example, the houses on your street, or the entranceway to your home, and then link the things to be recalled with the series of localities in sequence. The system could be used for memorizing both words and content, and appears to have been extremely effective. Remarkably, such a system remains at the core of all modern memory systems today. Despite our ready access to computers and teleprompters, the ability to deliver an argument or speech from memory, recalling pertinent facts without reliance on other means, is an effective tool in oral communication and can certainly enhance any speaker's presentation. In De Orator 2.351-60, Cicero relates the origin of this type of memory system and outlines the benefits that having a good memory offer to a speaker. And I am thankful to Simonides of Ceos, who is said to have been the first to introduce the art of memory. According to this story, Simonides was dining at Cranon in Thessaly at the house of Scopas, a rich nobleman. When he had finished singing the poem that he had composed in Scopus's honor, in which he had written much about Castor and Pollux for the sake of embellishment, as poets do, Scopas reacted with excessive stinginess. He told him that he would pay him only half the agreed fee for this poem. If he liked, he could ask for the rest from his friends Castor and Pollux, who had received half the praise. A little later, the story goes on, Simonides received a message to go outside. 2 young men were standing at the door, who were urgently asking for him. He got up and went outside, but saw no one. In the meantime, precisely while he was gone, the room where Scopas was giving his banquet collapsed, and Scopas, together with his relatives, was buried under the fallen roof and died. When their families wanted to arrange their funerals, but could not possibly distinguish them because they had been completely crushed, it was reportedly Simonides who, from his recollection of the place where each of them had been reclining at table, identified every one of them for burial. Prompted by this experience, he is then said to have made the discovery that order is what most brings light to our memory, and he concluded that those who would like to employ this part of their abilities should choose localities, then form mental images of the things they wanted to store in their memory, and place these in the localities. In this way, the order of the localities would preserve the order of the things, while the images would represent the things themselves, and we would use the localities like a wax tablet, and the representations like the letters written on it. What need is there for me to mention the benefit that the memory offers to the orator, its great usefulness, and its great power? That you can retain what you learned when accepting a case, as well as what you have thought out yourself about it. That you can have all of your thoughts fixed in your mind, and your entire supply of words neatly arranged. That you can listen in such a way to your client who instructs you about the case, or to your opponent whom you will have to answer, that what they say is not just poured into your ears, but seems inscribed into your mind. Accordingly, only those with a powerful memory know what they are going to say, how far they will pursue it, how they will say it, which points they have already answered and which still remain. Such people also remember much of the material they have used in the past in other cases, and much that they have heard others use. Now I do acknowledge that nature is the chief source of this asset, as it is of everything that I have been talking about before. But it is true of the whole art of speaking, that its function is not to produce or create from scratch what is nowhere present in our own natural abilities, but to rear and develop what has already been born and created within us. Yet, there is barely anyone whose memory is so keen that he can retain the order of all words and thoughts without arranging his material and representing it by symbols, nor anyone, really, whose memory is so dull that practicing this system on a regular basis will not help him at all. Indeed, as Simonides wisely observed, or whoever it was who discovered this, the things best pictured by our minds are those that have been conveyed and imprinted on them by one of the senses. Now the keenest of all our senses is the sense of sight. Therefore, things perceived by our hearing or during our thought processes can be most easily grasped by the mind if they are also conveyed to our minds through the mediation of the eyes. In this way, as he saw, invisible objects that are inaccessible to the judgment of sight are represented by a kind of figure, an image, a shape, so that things we can scarcely take hold of by thinking may be grasped, so to speak, by looking at them. But these concrete forms, just like everything that falls under the faculty of sight, must be located somewhere, for a concrete object without a locality is inconceivable. Consequently, for I don't want to talk too much or be obtrusive while the subject is so well known and common, the localities we use must be numerous, clearly visible, and at moderate intervals, while our images should be lively, sharp, and conspicuous, with the potential to present themselves quickly and to strike the mind. Practice, the starting point for developing a habit, will provide the requisite skill. Memorization of words, which is less necessary for us, is characterized by a greater variety of images. After all, there are many words that serve as joints connecting the limbs of our language, and it is impossible to find shapes that resemble these. For them, we must mold images for constant use. Memorization of content, however, is the proper business of the orator. This is where we can use representation by separate, well-placed persons and objects, so that we can apprehend thoughts by means of images, and their order by means of the localities. And it is not true, as lazy people always say, that the memory is overwhelmed by the weight of the images, and that they even obscure what our natural memory could have grasped by itself. I myself have met eminent people with almost superhuman memories, Charmidas in Athens and in Asia Metrodorus of Sepsis, who is said to be still alive, and both said that they recorded what they wanted to remember by means of images in the localities that they had chosen, just as if they were writing them out by means of letters on a wax tablet. Hence, if someone does not have a natural faculty of memory, this practice cannot be used to unearth one, but if one is latent, the practice should be used to make it grow. Delivery. We have all probably heard the old adage, "It's not what you say, but how you say it," and we know from the experience of listening to public speakers, be they politicians, priests, or professors, that there is much truth in that statement. At times this can be a very unfortunate circumstance, for example, when a very good message with very important content is obscured because of a terrible presentation, or conversely, when poor content, or even false and misleading information is made to sound appealing and overwhelmingly convincing because of an excellent manner of presentation. In any case, the importance of delivery, the fifth and final activity of the orator, was highly appreciated in antiquity, just as it is today. In fact, in order to illustrate its importance, Cicero was wont to relate a famous anecdote about the great Greek orator, Demosthenes. And this bears out the truth of the saying attributed to Demosthenes, who, when asked what was the primary consideration in speaking, replied, "Delivery." What was second? Delivery. And again, what was third? Delivery. No other thing penetrates the mind more deeply, fashions, forms, and flexes it, and causes speakers to seem such persons as they themselves wish to seem. Brutus 142. So, just as location is a prime factor in real estate considerations, so is delivery in terms of argument and oratory. Theoretical discussions of delivery often divided the subject into two categories, voice and movement, with movement then further subdivided into gesture and facial expression. In De Orator, Cicero discusses voice, gesture, and facial expression, and links them closely to portraying the emotions desired by the speaker. In the following passage, Crassus, the chief character of the dialogue, discusses these topics with the others and relates other interesting anecdotes about the delivery of skillful speakers. All of these things, however, are as effective as their delivery makes them. Delivery, I am telling you, is the one dominant factor in oratory. Without it, even the best orator cannot be of any account at all, while an average speaker equipped with this skill can often outdo the best orators. It is to delivery that they say Demosthenes, when asked what was most important in oratory, gave first, second, and third place. And I generally tend to think that what Aeschines said is even better. Having been disgracefully defeated in court, he had left Athens and taken refuge at Rhodes. There, he is said to have read, at the request of the Rhodians, the outstanding speech that he had given against Ctesiphon, when Demosthenes was pleading for the defense. After completing the reading, he was also asked to read, on the next day, the speech that Demosthenes had delivered on the other side, on behalf of Ctesiphon. This he did in an extremely powerful and pleasant voice, and when everyone expressed admiration, he said, "How much more you would admire it, if you had heard Demosthenes himself." By this comment, he sufficiently indicated the great importance of delivery, inasmuch as in his view, the same speech would actually be different if someone else were to deliver it. What was it in Gracchus, whom you, Catullus, remember better than I, that was talked about so much when I was young? Where can I take refuge in my misery? Where can I turn? To the Capitol? But that is overflowing with my brother's blood. To home? So that I can see my mother in misery, grief-stricken and downcast? People generally agreed that, when delivering these words, he used his eyes, voice, and gestures to such effect that even his enemies could not contain their tears. I am talking about this in some detail because the orators, who act in real life, have abandoned this entire field, while the actors, who are only imitators of reality, have appropriated it. And no doubt, in everything reality has the advantage over imitation. Yet if reality by itself were sufficiently effective in delivery, we would have no need for any art at all. But emotions, which must especially be expressed or imitated through delivery, are often so confused that they are obscured and almost smothered. So we must get rid of what obscures them and embrace their most prominent and most clearly visible features. For by nature, every emotion has its own facial expression, tone of voice, and gesture. The entire body of a human being, all the facial expressions and all the utterances of the voice, like the strings on a lyre, sound exactly in the way they are struck by each emotion. The voice is stretched taut like the strings of an instrument, to respond to each and every touch, to sound high, low, fast, slow, loud, and soft. And apart from each of these extremes, there is also, in each category, a middle between the extremes. Moreover, from these kinds of sounds are also derived others, smooth and rough, restrained and wide-ranging, sustained and staccato, hoarse and cracked, and with crescendo and diminuendo and a changing of pitch. The employment of each of these kinds falls under the regulation of art. They are at our disposal to be varied at will in delivery, just as colors are in painting. Anger requires the use of one kind of voice, high and sharp, excited, breaking off repeatedly. Fear again has another kind of voice, subdued, hesitating, and downcast. Energy has yet another kind, intense, vehement, threatening, and with an earnest sort of excitement. Happiness needs another tone, unrestrained and tender, cheerful and relaxed. All of these emotions ought to be accompanied by gestures, not those used in the manner of the stage, which depict the individual words, but gestures that indicate the content and the ideas as a whole, not by imitating them, but by signifying them. For this, one needs the vigorous and manly attitude of the body derived not from stage actors, but from those who fight with weapons or in the palestra. The hands should not be too expressive, accompanying rather than depicting the words with the fingers. The arms should extend forward a bit, as if our speech were employing it as a weapon, and you should stamp your foot at the beginning or at the end of energetic passages. But everything depends on the face, and this, in turn, is entirely dominated by the eyes. So the older generation was quite right to praise not even Roscius overmuch when he acted wearing a mask. For delivery is wholly a matter of the soul, and the face is an image of the soul, while the eyes reflect it. The face is the only part of the body that can produce as many varying signs as there are feelings in the soul, and there is surely no one who could produce these same effects with his eyes closed. Theophrastus actually says that a certain Touriscus was fond of calling someone who fixed his eyes on some object while delivering his speech an actor with his back turned. Consequently, it is quite important to regulate the expression of the eyes. We should not alter the appearance of the face itself too much, so as to avoid distorting it or acting like a fool. It is the eyes that should be used to signify our feelings in a way suited to the actual type of our speech, by an intense or relaxed, or a fixed or cheerful look. Delivery is, so to speak, the language of the body, which makes it all the more essential that it should correspond to what we intend to say. And nature has actually given us eyes, as it has given the horse and the lion their manes, tails, and ears, for indicating our feelings. So the most effective element in our delivery, next to the voice, is the expression on our face, and this is controlled by our eyes. Now all the elements of delivery possess a certain force that has been bestowed by nature. That is why delivery strongly affects even the inexperienced, the common crowd, and also foreigners. After all, words affect only those who are joined to the speaker by the bond of a shared language, and clever thoughts often escape the understanding of people who are not so clever. But delivery, which displays the feelings of the soul, affects everyone, because everyone's soul is stirred by the same feelings, and it is through the same signs that people recognize them in others and reveal them in themselves. When we look at effectiveness and excellence in delivery, the voice undoubtedly plays the most important part. In the first place, a good voice is a desirable thing to have. But in the second place, whatever sort of voice we do have, it is something that ought to be protected. In this connection, the question of how to care for our voice is not really pertinent to the kind of instruction I am giving now, though I do believe that we should take good care of it. But the observation that I made a little while ago seems not at all irrelevant to my task in this conversation, namely that in the majority of things, what is most useful is somehow also what is most appropriate. In order to preserve the voice, nothing is more useful than frequent modulation, while nothing is more harmful than unrestrained, uninterrupted exertion. And indeed, what is more suitable for our ears and for a pleasing delivery than alternation, variety, and change? Actually, the Gracchus whom I mentioned earlier acted accordingly. When he was addressing a public meeting, he always had someone standing inconspicuously behind him with a little ivory flute, a skillful man who would sound a quick note that would either rouse him when his voice had dropped, or call him back when he was speaking in a strained voice. There is a middle range in every voice, though this is different in every individual case. Raising the voice gradually from this level is useful as well as pleasing, since shouting right from the start is a coarse thing to do, and this gradual approach is at the same time salutary, as it will strengthen the voice. Moreover, there is a certain limit to raising the voice, which is still below the level of shouting at the highest pitch. Beyond this the flute will not allow you to go, while it will also call you back when you are actually reaching this limit. Likewise, at the other end of the scale, when you are dropping your voice there is also a lowest sound, and this you reach step by step, descending from pitch to pitch. By this variation, and by thus running through all the pitches, the voice will both preserve itself and make the delivery pleasing. And while you will leave the man with his flute at home, you will bring with you to the forum a feeling for these things, derived from practice. De Orator 3.213-27. The value of imitating good models of speaking. In antiquity as today, the imitation of good models was considered an effective means of education. In fact, in Cicero's day it was common for a young man to enter into a sort of apprenticeship, called the tirocinium fori, during which he would be attached to a prominent citizen or statesman in order to observe his activity in the forum and in the courts. It was also important to choose good models in public speaking, and to imitate their strengths, while disregarding their weaknesses. Antonius, the other chief character in De Orator, expounds on the use of good models of effective persuasion, as he gives advice to his young protégés, Catullus and Sulpicius, on this matter. Well, Catullus, let me take our friend Sulpicius here as my starting point. I first heard him in a minor case, when he was quite young. His voice, his appearance, his bodily movements, and all his other qualities were well suited for the task that we are considering. His manner of speaking, however, was quick and impetuous, a mark of his talent. His words were boiling over with excitement, and were a little too exuberant, a mark of his youth. I did not think this contemptible. I like to see fertility in a young man, for, as with vines, it is easier to check what has grown too abundantly than to produce new shoots by cultivation if the stock is weak. Likewise, in a young man, I want to have something to prune away, for in a growth that has reached maturity too quickly, vitality cannot be long-lived. I immediately recognized his talent, and without losing any time, I encouraged him to take the forum as the school where he could learn, and to choose the teacher he preferred. But if he listened to my advice, it should be Lucius Crassus. The fellow jumped at my suggestion and assured me that this was what he was going to do, also adding, out of courtesy no doubt, that I too would be his teacher. Scarcely a year had passed from the time of the conversation in which I gave him this encouragement, when he prosecuted Gaius Norbanus, and I defended him. The difference that I noticed between the Sulpicius of that occasion and the one that I had seen the year before was incredible. It is absolutely true that his own natural abilities were leading him to that magnificent and splendid manner of Crassus. This would not, however, have enabled him to achieve sufficient results, had he not aimed at this same goal by energetically imitating Crassus and developed the habit of speaking with all his thoughts and attention focused on him. This, then, must be the first rule I give to the prospective orator. I will show him whom he should imitate. The next thing, to be joined to this, is practice, through which he must imitate, and thus carefully reproduce his chosen model, but not in the way I have known many imitators to do, for people often direct their imitation to features that are easily copied, or even to all but faulty ones that happen to be conspicuous. Nothing is easier than to imitate the way someone dresses or stands or moves. And surely if the model has some fault, it is no great thing to adopt that and to exhibit the same fault yourself, like this Fufius, who is raving on in the state even now, after losing his voice. His oratory fails to achieve the vigor of Gaius Fimbria, which the latter certainly possessed, while he does imitate his distorted mouth and his broad pronunciation. But Fufius did not know how to choose the most suitable model for himself, and the model he did choose, he wanted to imitate even in terms of his faults. Anyone who is going to do things properly must, first, be very careful in making his choice, and he must also devote all his attention to attaining those qualities of his approved model that are truly outstanding. Whoever, then, wants to achieve such resemblance through imitation, must pursue this goal by frequent and extensive practice, and particularly by writing. Our friend Sulpicius's language would be much more compact if he did this. As it is, it occasionally has a sort of luxuriance about it, as farmers say about grass when it is at the height of its growth, which should be grazed down by the pen. De Orator 2.88 to 92-96. The value of writing to prepare for effective speaking. The importance of learning to write clearly and cogently is well recognized in educational circles today. Increasing numbers, too, are acknowledging the importance of effective verbal communication as an important skill to be imparted to our students entering the world. The link between good speaking and good writing, while not readily apparent to some, was certainly clear to Cicero. As mentioned earlier, 12 to 13, effective written composition entails the activities of invention, arrangement, and style, the first three of the 5 activities of the orator, and as such serves as a model exercise in training for effective speaking. For my part, said Crassus, I approve of your habit of taking as a starting point some case very similar to those brought into the forum, and of speaking on it in a manner that is as true to life as possible. Most people, however, when doing this, merely exercise their voices, and not very knowledgeably at that, build their strength, quicken the speed of their tongues, and revel in the flood of their words. They have heard the saying that the way to become a speaker is to speak, and this misleads them. For there is another saying that is equally true: the easiest way to become a wretched speaker is to speak wretchedly. For this reason, although it is also useful, in these practice sessions of yours, to speak extemporaneously on a regular basis, it is still more useful to take some time for reflection, in order to speak better prepared and with greater care. What is most fundamental, however, is something that, to be honest, we do least of all, for it involves a great deal of effort, which most of us try to avoid. I mean writing as much as possible. It is the pen, that is the best and most eminent teacher and creator of speaking, and I am saying this with very good reason. If extemporaneous and random speech is easily surpassed by preparation and reflection, the latter, in turn, will certainly be outdone by constant and diligent writing. For as we investigate the matter and consider it with all of our powers of discernment, all commonplaces, at least as far as they are inherent in the subject on which we are writing, those provided by the art as well as those provided, in a way, by natural ability and intelligence, occur to us, revealing themselves to our minds. All the thoughts and all the words that are most appropriate to each type of subject, and that are most clear and brilliant, cannot help but pass under the point of our pen one after the other. In addition, writing perfects the ability of actually arranging and combining words, not in a poetic, but in a kind of oratorical measure and rhythm. These are the things that win a good orator shouts of approval and admiration, and no one will master them unless he has written long and written much, even if he has trained himself ever so vigorously in those extemporaneous speeches. Also, whoever comes to oratory after much practice in writing brings this ability along. Even when he is improvising, what he says will still turn out to resemble a written text. And what is more, should he take a piece of text with him when he is going to speak, once he has stopped following this, the remainder of his speech will continue to resemble it. A ship at full speed, when once the rowers rest upon their oars, still maintains its own momentum and course, even though the thrust of the oar strokes has been interrupted. The same thing happens in the case of a speech. When the written text leaves off, the remainder of the speech still maintains a like course, sped on by the similarity to what was written and by its impulse. What I used to do as a very young man in my daily practice sessions was to apply myself especially to the same exercise that I knew Gaius Carbo, my old enemy, had always employed. I would set up as a model some verses, as impressive as possible, or I would read a speech, as much of it as I could manage to memorize, and then I would express exactly what I had read, choosing different words as much as I could. But after a while, I noticed this method had a defect. The words that were most fitting in each case, and that were the finest and most distinguished, had already been appropriated by Ennius, if I was practicing with his verses, or by Gracchus, if I happened to use a speech of his as my model. If therefore I chose the same words, I gained nothing, and if I chose others, I was actually doing myself harm, because I was getting used to employing words that were less appropriate. Afterward, it seemed a good idea, and this was the practice I adopted when I was a bit older, to take speeches of the great orators from Greece and reformulate them. The advantage of choosing these was not only that, when rendering in Latin what I had read in Greek, I could use the finest words that were nevertheless common, but also that, by imitating Greek words, I could coin certain others that were new to our language, provided they were appropriate. De Orator 1.149-55. The requirements and education of the ideal speaker. As we look back on the entries in this brief volume, and consider the activities of the speaker and rhetorical precepts offered in the typical rhetorical handbooks of Cicero's day, we realize that we have encountered only the proverbial tip of the iceberg. A full accounting of all the rules for persuasion would fill many volumes of this size. Moreover, according to Cicero, the precepts for persuasion contained in the typical handbooks are only a small part of what goes into creating a real speaker, one who possesses the genuine power and ability to persuade his listeners. The challenge of speaking effectively in public is a monumental one, and to do so with effectiveness and success requires not merely knowledge of the precepts of the art of rhetoric, a considerable amount of inborn talent, and diligent practice, but also a capacious knowledge, broad and deep, of those subjects that we still know today as the liberal arts. It is fitting to conclude our survey of Ciceronian persuasion where Cicero himself begins, in the preface of De Orator, addressed to his brother, Quintus. Marcus speaks at some length about the difficulty of becoming a great speaker, and he outlines what he considers the requisites of the ideal orator, the exploration of which he then pursues in the subsequent pages of his great masterpiece. As he readily concedes, few people are up to such demands, but knowledge of the art, application of our intellects, and a broad education will help all of us to become more effective speakers, who know how to convince people and win an argument. For my part, whenever I reflect upon the greatest and most gifted men, it always seems that the following question requires an answer. Why have more people come forward to distinguish themselves in every other art than in oratory? Turn your thoughts and attention where you will, and you see a great many who excel in each kind of endeavor, not merely in the minor arts, but in those we might call the most important. For instance, should anyone choose to evaluate the knowledge of illustrious men in terms of the usefulness or importance of their accomplishments, would he not grant precedence to the general over the orator? Yet there is no doubt that, even from our state alone, we could produce an almost endless list of absolutely outstanding leaders in war, but could name barely a few who have excelled in oratory. Furthermore, many have emerged who had the ability to guide and steer the state by wisdom and counsel, many in our own memory, more in our fathers, and even more in our ancestors, whereas for quite a long time there were no good speakers at all, an entire generation scarcely produced even a tolerable one. But some perhaps think that this art of oratory should be compared with other pursuits, namely those involved with abstruse branches of study, and with varied and extensive reading, rather than with the qualities of the general, or the wisdom of the good senator. If so, let them indeed turn their attention to these kinds of arts and examine who and how many have distinguished themselves in each. In this way, they will quite easily infer how very small the number of orators is and always has been. For instance, as you of course know, the most learned consider philosophy, as the Greeks call it, to be the creator and mother of all the valuable arts, so to speak. Yet even here in philosophy, it is difficult to reckon how many people there have been, so notable for their abundant knowledge and for the variety and vast range of their studies, who have not only worked as specialists in one single area, but have embraced all that exists in their thorough investigations or their dialectical reasonings. We all know how obscure the subjects handled by the so-called mathematicians are, and how abstruse, complex, and exact is the art with which they deal. Yet even in this area, so many geniuses have emerged that almost no one who has devoted his energies to mastering it appears to have been unsuccessful. As to the theory of music, and the study of language and literature so popular nowadays, the profession of the so-called grammarians, has anyone really dedicated himself to them without managing to acquire enough knowledge to cover the complete, almost infinite range and material of those arts? I think I am justified in saying that, of all those who have been involved in the pursuit and study of the truly noble arts, the smallest contingent to emerge has been that of outstanding poets and speakers. Yet again, if you look at this group, where excellence is so very rare, and are willing to make a careful selection both from our number and from that of the Greeks, you will find that there have been far fewer good orators than good poets. This fact is all the more amazing when we realize that the study of the other arts draws as a rule upon abstruse and hidden sources, whereas all the procedures of oratory lie within everyone's reach and are concerned with everyday experience and with human nature and speech. This means that in the other arts the highest achievement is precisely that which is most remote from what the uninitiated can understand and perceive, whereas in oratory it is the worst possible fault to deviate from the ordinary mode of speaking and the generally accepted way of looking at things. One cannot even truly maintain that more people dedicate themselves to the other arts, or that those who do are motivated to master them because these offer more pleasure or richer hopes or greater rewards. And in this respect, I need not mention Greece, which has always aspired to the leading position in eloquence, or the famous city of Athens, the inventor of all learning, where oratory in its highest form was both discovered and perfected, for surely even in this community of ours, no study has ever enjoyed more vigorous popularity than the study of eloquence. Once we had established our authority over all nations and a stable peace had provided us with leisure, almost every ambitious young man thought he should devote himself to oratory with all the energy he had. At first, it is true, they accomplished only as much as their own natural ability and reflection allowed, for they were unaware of any theory, and assumed there was no definite method of practicing or any rule of art whatsoever. But once they had heard Greek orators, had come to know Greek writings on the subject, and had called in teachers, our people were fired with a really incredible zeal for learning all these things. They were urged on by the scope, variety, and frequency of cases of every type, so that the theoretical knowledge that each had acquired by his own study was supplemented by constant practice, which was more effective than the precepts of all teachers. In addition, there were laid before them, just as there are now, the greatest rewards for this pursuit, in terms of influence, power, and prestige. Moreover, there are many indications that the natural ability of our people was far superior to that of all others, from every other nation. Considering all this, who would not rightly be amazed that, in the entire history of generations, of ages, and of communities, such a slight number of orators is to be found? The truth of the matter is, however, that this faculty is something greater, and is a combination of more arts and pursuits, than is generally supposed. For, in view of the enormous number of apprentices, the rich supply of available teachers, the exceptional talents engaged, the infinite variety of cases, and the utterly magnificent rewards held out for eloquence, the only conceivable explanation of this scarcity is surely the incredible scope and difficulty of oratory. To begin with, one must acquire knowledge of a very great number of things, for without this a ready flow of words is empty and ridiculous. The language itself has to be shaped, not only by the choice of words but by their arrangement as well. Also required is a thorough acquaintance with all the emotions with which nature has endowed the human race, because in soothing or in exciting the feelings of the audience the full force of oratory and all its available means must be brought into play. In addition, it is essential to possess a certain esprit and humor, the culture that befits a gentleman, and an ability to be quick and concise in rebuttal as well as attack, combined with refinement, grace, and urbanity. Moreover, one must know the whole past with its storehouse of examples and precedents, nor should one fail to master statutes and the civil law. Surely I don't need to add anything about delivery? This must be regulated by the movement of the body, by gesture, by facial expression, and by inflecting and varying the voice. Just how much effort this requires, even by itself, is indicated by the trivial art of actors on the stage. For although every one of them strives to regulate his facial expression, voice, and movement, we all know how really few actors there are, and have been, whom we can watch without irritation. What shall I say about that universal treasure house, the memory? It is clear that unless this faculty is applied as a guard over the ideas and words that we have devised and thought out for our speech, all the qualities of the orator, however brilliant, will go to waste. Let us stop wondering, then, why there are so few eloquent speakers, seeing that eloquence depends on the combination of all these accomplishments, any one of which alone would be a tremendous task to perfect. Let us rather encourage our children, and all others whose fame and reputation are dear to us, to appreciate fully its enormous scope. They should not rely on the precepts or the teachers or the methods of practice in general use, but be confident that they can achieve their goals by means that are of a quite different order. It is at least my opinion that it will be impossible for anyone to be an orator endowed with all praiseworthy qualities, unless he has gained a knowledge of all important subjects and arts. For it is certainly from knowledge that a speech should blossom and acquire fullness. Unless the orator has firmly grasped the underlying subject matter, his speech will remain an utterly empty, yes, almost childish verbal exercise. De Orator 1.6-20, a Ciceronian cheat sheet for effective speaking. 1. Nature, art, and practice. These are the three requisites for becoming an effective speaker. The good speaker must possess certain qualities bestowed by nature, for example, a pleasant voice and the ability to project it. Knowledge of the systematic body of rhetorical precepts, that is, mastery of the art of rhetoric, is likewise essential. Finally, one's natural gifts and knowledge of the rules must be polished and enhanced by diligent and purposeful practice. 2. Eloquence is a powerful weapon. The human capacity for thought and the ability to express that thought through persuasive speech are, according to Cicero, what separate humans from all other creatures. When channeled correctly and informed by good thinking, eloquent speech is the most powerful weapon for effecting good in society. The most gifted speakers should always keep in mind the power that their speech wields over others, and use it for the betterment of their communities. 3. Identify, arrange, memorize. When setting out to construct an argument or a speech, one should first identify the point at issue and discover appropriate material for proving it. Next, arrange that material effectively and strategically. Apply a fitting style. Then, if necessary, commit it to memory. And finally, employ appropriate ways to deliver the arguments. These are the so-called activities of a speaker, outlining the tasks and the order in which to construct an effective speech. The first three activities can also be employed effectively in written composition. 4. Not by logic alone. Persuasion involves more than simply arguing logically. The speaker has available three sources of persuasion: rational argumentation, proof based on character, and emotional appeal. Aristotle identified these sources of proof or persuasion, and Cicero recommends using all of them to teach, to delight, and to move our audience. One can argue using the tools of logic, for example, deductive and inductive reasoning as illustrated by the syllogism and example, or rely on proof, based in the portrayal of one's character, or persuade by appealing to the emotions. There are times and places for each, and the skillful speaker will know when and where to engage these various modes of proof. 5. Know your audience. When actually composing the words, sentences, and paragraphs of an argument or a speech, the speaker should remember that different styles exist, and that a particular occasion and audience demand a particular and suitable style, be it the plain, middle, or grand. It makes a difference whether one is arguing with a friend, or presenting a position paper in a class, or arguing a brief before a court of law. The effective speaker will adapt his or her level of style according to the occasion and the audience that is being addressed. 6. Be clear, be correct. Regardless of the particular style adopted, speakers will assiduously apply the virtues or qualities of style to their speech or argument: correctness, clarity, distinction, and appropriateness. No matter the stylistic level at which an argument is pitched, the speaker must ensure that the language employed is correct in its syntax and grammar, that it is expressed in the clearest possible way, that it is made distinctive by the use of figures of thought and speech, and that it is entirely appropriate to the time, occasion, and audience. 7. Delivery matters. Sometimes it's not what you say, but how you say it. Cicero understood and appreciated the power of delivery, that is, the way a speech or argument is presented. All of us, perhaps, have experienced a teacher who was in possession of a brilliant intellect and encyclopedic knowledge of a subject, but could not present that material clearly and cogently. Conversely, we have perhaps also heard a politician or a salesman sweep people off their feet with a dazzling presentation that, under closer inspection, lacks any real substance. Effective delivery of an argument or a speech, employing both voice and gesture skillfully, can be the decisive factor in winning an argument. 8. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and more. Cicero believed strongly in finding good models to imitate. The best speakers are those who have identified excellent models and who have made it a habit to imitate their strengths, while leaving aside their weaknesses. Several models are worthy of consideration, gleaning what is best from each. 9. The pen is often mightier than the sword. The tongue may be a gifted speaker's most important weapon, but the pen, according to Cicero, is close behind. If you wish to improve your speaking ability, writing variously and much, is, Cicero maintains, the key to achieving your goal. 10. Words without substance are hollow things. Cicero believed firmly that the most effective, persuasive speech follows naturally from the underlying subject matter. Without solid and extensive knowledge as a foundation, the words that flow from a speaker's mouth are nothing but child's prattle. For this reason, Cicero's ideal speaker is one who not only knows and understands the rules as outlined in the art of rhetoric, but even more importantly is a person who is steeped in the knowledge of literature, history, law, philosophy, in short, in all of those subjects we know today as the liberal arts.